There is a specific category of German commander from the Second World War whose operational record sits almost entirely in the shadow of names that sold more books. Rommel, Manstein, Guderian. Despite having directed armored operations of comparable scale across a wider geographical range than any of them. Ewald von Kleist commands panzer forces from the opening campaign in Poland through the fall of France, the Balkans, the drive into the Soviet Union, and the deepest German armored penetration of the entire Eastern Front into the Caucasus Mountains, a distance from Berlin that places his forces further east than any German army in history. He does all of this without the biographical mythology that attaches to his contemporaries, which is partly a function of personality, and partly a function of the campaigns themselves being less cinematically contained than the North African desert or the Normandy hedgerows. The historical record that Kleist leaves behind is not a record of dramatic personal charisma or controversial command decisions that generate decades of debate. It is a record of armored operations executed across terrain that ranges from Polish plains to French river crossings to Ukrainian steppe to Caucasian mountain approaches. Each campaign demanding different solutions to the same fundamental problems of mass, speed, supply, and the tension between what armored doctrine promises and what roads, fuel, and enemy resistance actually deliver. Understanding Kleist requires starting not with tanks, but with cavalry. Ewald von Kleist is born August 8, 1881 in Braunfels, in the German state of Hesse, into a Prussian military family whose officer tradition stretches back generations. He enters the Imperial German Army as a cavalry officer, serving in the First World War in both cavalry and staff positions. The transition from cavalry to armored command that he eventually makes is not the intellectual leap it appears from the outside. The operational principles that govern cavalry employment, using speed and mass to strike flanks and exploit breaches before the enemy can reorient his defense, translate directly into mechanized doctrine once the horse is replaced by a 25-ton tank burning dozens of gallons of fuel per hour. By 1939, Kleist is 58 years old and commanding a cavalry corps within an army that is in the process of rebuilding its armored arm under officers who are, on average, 15 years younger. His appointment to lead Panzergruppe Kleist, the largest concentrated armored formation committed to any single operational axis in the French campaign, reflects a command assessment that values his ability to manage large formations across complex operational problems, even as the doctrinal enthusiasm for armored warfare belongs primarily to a younger generation of officers who have spent the interwar years arguing for tanks in ways Kleist's cavalry background did not predispose him toward. The friction between Kleist and Guderian during the French campaign of May 1940 crystallizes this generational and doctrinal tension into something that nearly stops one of the most operationally decisive armored thrusts of the war. Panzergruppe Kleist drives through the Ardennes in May 1940 with a force built around roughly 1,200 tanks, crossing terrain that German planners had assessed as largely impassable for armored vehicles. Narrow forest roads, steep gradients, limited bridge capacity across streams and rivers that armored vehicles weighing 20 to 25 tons stress to their structural limits. The logistical compression this terrain produces is severe. Fuel convoys carrying drums weighing more than 40 pounds each queue for miles on Ardennes roads, while tank commanders at the front consume reserves faster than trucks can push forward. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps forms the southern element of Kleist's group and crosses the Meuse at Sedan on May 13, 1940. An assault crossing against French defensive positions that infantry and Stuka dive bombers prepare, while engineers assemble bridges capable of carrying tanks across the river under fire. The Meuse crossing fractures the French defensive system in ways that the broader battle takes days to fully register, but Guderian recognizes the opportunity immediately and begins driving west before the flanks of the crossing are properly secured. Kleist orders him to halt and consolidate. Guderian defies the order, offering his resignation when challenged, eventually receiving authorization to conduct what is diplomatically termed a reconnaissance in force that in practice means continuing the advance at full speed. The exchange between the two men, documented in both their post-war memoirs and in the contemporary operational records, reflects a genuine disagreement about acceptable risk rather than simple insubordination, but it also reflects Kleist's characteristic operational conservatism, a preference for securing what has been gained before extending further, that distinguishes his command style from Guderian's aggressive forward instinct throughout their working relationship. The advance to the Channel coast succeeds despite the tension, not because of it. German armored spearheads reached the English Channel near Abbeville on May 21, 1940, cutting off Allied forces in Belgium from those further south in France. The encirclement that follows traps the British Expeditionary Force and significant French formations against the coast. Kleist's Panzer Group has driven roughly 250 miles in roughly 10 days across terrain that conventional military thinking considered unsuitable for armored operations at that speed and scale. The fuel consumption across that advance runs into thousands of tons. Supply officers calculate daily requirements for the Panzer Group measured in hundreds of tons of gasoline, lubricants, and spare parts simply to maintain forward movement. A Panzer III weighing approximately 23 tons burns fuel at rates that require resupply every day of sustained operation. Multiply that across hundreds of tanks in multiple corps, and the logistical machinery sustaining the advance becomes as operationally critical as the tanks themselves. Then comes the halt order outside Dunkirk, a decision Kleist is involved in confirming, accepting the argument that the marshy Flanders terrain is unsuitable for tank operations and that the Luftwaffe can contain the evacuation. The decision, and its consequences, become one of the most analyzed command choices of the Western campaign. 338,000 Allied soldiers crossed to England during the 9 days the Panzers wait. The soldiers who board those ships at Dunkirk form the core of the army that eventually lands in Normandy 4 years later. Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941 deploy Kleist's armored group into terrain even more hostile to mechanized operations than the Ardennes. The Balkans campaign is frequently treated as a sideshow to the Eastern Front that follows it, but the operational problems it presents are not trivial. Greek and Yugoslav terrain fractures armored movement into narrow mountain corridors, where a single destroyed bridge or a determined defensive position can stall an entire division. Kleist's forces drive through Yugoslavia and into Greece, coordinating with infantry formations in terrain where tanks are frequently less useful than the artillery and engineers supporting them. The campaign concludes in roughly 3 weeks. Another demonstration of German operational tempo in difficult terrain that adds to Kleist's command record without generating the narrative simplicity that flat desert or open steppe allows. Operation Barbarossa commits Kleist's Panzer Group, redesignated 1st Panzer Group, to Army Group South's drive into Ukraine beginning June 22, 1941. The operational scale dwarfs anything the previous campaigns required. The advance into Ukraine across frontages measured in hundreds of miles, against Soviet forces whose initial disorganization conceals a depth and weight of resistance that becomes apparent as the summer progresses, demands logistical management of a complexity that the French campaign's 10-day sprint never tested. Fuel convoys operate across road networks that deteriorate under armored traffic from the first week. A Panzer IV weighing roughly 23 tons breaks road surfaces that summer rain turns to mud, and that the sheer density of armored traffic grinds into impassable conditions. The Battle of Encirclement at Uman in August 1941 traps 2 Soviet armies, the 6th and 12th, in a pocket where roughly 103,000 Soviet soldiers are eventually captured. Kleist's armored forces form the southern jaw of that encirclement, coordinating with infantry formations to close the pocket against Soviet breakout attempts. The operation is textbook in its execution and produces one of the significant early encirclement victories of the Barbarossa campaign. Kiev follows in September 1941, the largest encirclement battle of the entire war. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group drives north from the Kremenchug bridgehead on the Dnieper to link up with Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group driving south, closing a pocket around Kyiv that eventually captures roughly 665,000 Soviet soldiers, along with thousands of guns and hundreds of tanks. The distances involved in closing that encirclement, Kleist's forces driving roughly 150 miles north while Guderian's drive south, require sustained armored movement across Ukrainian terrain where fuel supply is already strained, and Soviet resistance attempts repeatedly to fracture the encirclement before it closes. Inside a tank from Kleist's group pushing north toward the link-up point in September 1941, the crew operates in heat that makes the steel interior almost physically unbearable during daytime movement. Dust from Ukrainian roads coats every external surface and filters into engine compartments, accelerating wear on components that require maintenance intervals the operational tempo rarely permits. The driver monitors fuel consumption against the distance remaining to the next supply point, with the specific anxiety of a man who understands what an empty tank means at that particular moment in that particular place. Kleist is promoted to General Feldmarschall in February 1943, the highest rank in the German army, following his management of the 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal from the Caucasus after Stalingrad fractures the German southern front. The Caucasus Campaign of 1942 represents the furthest eastern penetration of German forces in the entire war, and the operation most directly associated with Kleist's later command record. Army Group A under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, then briefly under Hitler's direct command, then under Kleist himself from November 1942, drives into the Caucasus during the summer and autumn of 1942 with the objective of seizing Soviet oil fields at Maykop, Grozny, and Baku. The oil at Baku alone produces roughly 70% of Soviet aviation fuel at that period, a strategic target whose capture would directly erode Soviet air power in ways that German planners believe might recalibrate the entire Eastern Front's balance. Maykop falls in August 1942, but the Soviet forces destroy the oil infrastructure before withdrawing so thoroughly that German engineers estimate reconstruction would require months. The fields that German planners had been counting on to solve their own fuel arithmetic produce almost nothing when captured. Grozny is never reached. The advance stalls in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains as Soviet resistance stiffens. German supply lines stretch to their absolute limit across the steppe between the Don and the mountains, and the Stalingrad crisis to the north begins consuming the operational reserves that might have sustained the Caucasus push. When Stalingrad fractures and Soviet forces threaten to cut off Army Group A entirely, Kleist manages the withdrawal of 1st Panzer Army from the Caucasus across the winter of 1942–43. A retreat conducted under Soviet pressure across hundreds of miles of steppe and through the Kuban bridgehead, maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness under conditions that have destroyed other formations entirely. The withdrawal is arguably his most technically demanding operational achievement, precisely because it produces no dramatic victory to attach to it. It produces survival, the preservation of an army group that the strategic situation had placed in genuine danger of complete destruction. Kleist is relieved of command in March 1944 as German forces in the south continue retreating under Soviet pressure. Hitler dismisses him alongside Manstein, removing two of the German army's most experienced operational commanders in a single decision, driven by the accumulating frustration of a leader who interprets strategic retreat as personal failure by his subordinates. He is captured by American forces in 1945, handed to Yugoslavia for trial on war crimes charges relating to operations in that country during the 1941 campaign, then transferred to Soviet custody. He dies in Soviet captivity in Vladimir Prison in October 1954, one of the last senior German commanders to die as a prisoner of war. The death in a Soviet prison is the final entry in a career that runs from cavalry officer in the First World War to the commander of the deepest German armored penetration in the East, and then backward through defeat, retreat, relief, capture, and years of imprisonment that outlast the war by nearly a decade. If the quiet has settled around you now and you are somewhere comfortable letting the geography of this sink in, Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, Ukraine, the Caucasus Mountains, and then the long road back through all of it, that is one man's operational range across 6 years of the most industrially violent war ever fought. The tanks that carried his formations across those distances burned fuel measured in thousands of tons and wore out components measured in millions of parts. The soldiers inside them were 20 years old on average, and many of them did not make the return journey. This is the entire history of Paul von Kleist, Panzer leader from Poland to the Caucasus during the Second World War. There's a genealogical document held in the German state archives, a handwritten Familienstammbaum, or family tree, that traces the House of Kleist across 7 centuries of Pomeranian history. And when you look at the branch where Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist's entry appears, you see what his birth actually meant in August of 1881. The branch is already crowded. There are colonels and cavalry commanders and pour le mérite recipients stretching back through the Frederiциan Wars, through the Napoleonic campaigns, through every armed crisis the Prussian state had passed through since the 17th century. 2 of those names carry the title Generalfeldmarschall, Field Marshal, before Paul's name even exists. He was born, in other words, not into a family that had a military tradition, but into a family that was a military tradition, and the distinction is not semantic. A tradition is something you choose to continue or refuse. An identity is something you're issued at birth, like the name itself. The Kleists were Pomeranian nobility, old Slavic origin territory absorbed into the Brandenburg Prussian state, gradually converted into the easternmost stronghold of German Protestant aristocratic culture. The family's roots are in Duberow and Zedlin and scattered estates across a landscape that doesn't exist in its old form anymore, absorbed now into Poland. What the family document shows is not just military service, but an unbroken logic of institutional commitment, generation after generation, that made the question of what a Kleist son would do with his life feel less like a question and more like a grammatical certainty. There's a Time magazine profile from 1940 that notes Kleist had 36 ancestors who held the rank of general in Prussian and Pomeranian armies. 36. You don't inherit that as an option. You inherit it as an obligation. His father breaks the pattern, and I think that matters enormously. Christoph Hugo Albrecht August von Kleist, Paul's father, was not a soldier. He was a Geheimer Studienrat, a senior civil servant in the educational administration, described in some accounts as a mathematics teacher of high rank. He died in 1886, when Paul was 5 years old, which means the boy grew up inside the Kleist name and the Kleist reputation without a living father to give that name a human face. The military identity Paul von Kleist absorbed was therefore filtered entirely through institutional memory, through the family archive, through the regimental tales, through the weight of a surname that had accumulated 2 centuries of Iron Cross recipients. He was raised not by a soldier, but by the idea of soldiers, and there is a difference. Men raised by the idea of something tend to become more doctrinally committed to it than men who watched it practiced daily and saw its limitations up close. On the 9th of March, 1900, at the age of 18, Paul von Kleist enlisted in the Prussian Field Artillery Regiment, General Feldzeugmeister No. 3, as a Fahnenjunker, an officer cadet. He was commissioned as a lieutenant on the 18th of August, 1901. The choice of artillery is telling in retrospect. The Kleists were cavalry people. The family's social world ran through hussar regiments and the riding culture of the Junker East. But the artillery entry suggests a young officer willing to engage with the technical side of warfare that the cavalry establishment still quietly disdained. He was already, at 18, a more pragmatic man than the institution he was joining. The Kriegsakademie in Berlin, which Kleist entered for general staff training around 1910, was the apex of this institutional world. The academy ran a 3-year curriculum integrating mathematics, military history, operational theory, and applied staff exercises, and it was selective enough that admission effectively marked an officer as destined for high command. The curriculum was Clausewitzian at its core, Warfare understood as an extension of politics, the friction of reality measured against the geometry of planning. But the pedagogical method was something more specific than theory. It was pattern recognition. Students were drilled in military history, not as narrative, but as case law, taught to find the operative structure beneath the tactical surface of every engagement from Leuthen to Sedan. The Academy's method produced officers who weren't merely competent administrators. It produced officers who read battles the way lawyers read precedents. Kleist was one of them. And the habit of mind he developed at the Kriegsakademie, the instinct to find the structural principle beneath the specific event, would be the defining intellectual characteristic of everything he later did with armor. On the 22nd of March, 1914, he was promoted to Hauptmann and joined the 1st Life Hussars Regiment, Leib Husaren Regiment Nummer 1, one of the most socially prestigious cavalry units in the Imperial German Army. He was 32 years old, recently graduated from the Staff Academy, assigned to the regiment of Hussar Kings and aristocratic horsemen, and he had 5 months before the world those hussars were made for would cease to exist entirely. What I keep returning to when I look at that specific career arc, artillery entrance, staff training, cavalry placement, is the deliberateness of it. This was a man constructing a professional identity with architectural precision, assembling the credentials that a Kleist son was expected to hold. The war would disassemble all of it. When the German 8th Army encircled and destroyed 2 Russian armies at Tannenberg in late August of 1914, the victory was achieved through a combination of railway speed, radio intelligence, and encirclement maneuver that had nothing to do with cavalry. The German cavalry divisions in East Prussia in those weeks were used primarily for screening and reconnaissance, useful, sometimes decisive in secondary roles, but not the blade of the battle. The battle was won by infantry movement along rail lines and by staff coordination that could process information and issue orders faster than the Russian command system could respond. Kleist was there, commanding a cavalry squadron, and what he witnessed was a preview of a problem that would define the next 20 years of his professional life. The arm he'd been trained to master was becoming structurally marginal in the war that was actually happening. The Eastern Front in 1914 was, briefly, the last theater where cavalry retained something resembling its pre-war utility. The vast spaces of East Prussia and Russian Poland, the sparser trench density, the greater operational distances, all of these gave mounted units more room to operate than the Western Front's immediate conversion to continuous trench lines allowed. German cavalry on the Eastern Front screened flanks, raided supply lines, and occupied ground too thinly held to be defended by infantry. But even here, by the end of 1914, the machine gun and barbed wire were imposing the same fundamental logic they'd imposed in France. Horses were targets, not weapons, and the arm's traditional offensive role was dead. Kleist commanded a cavalry squadron through this transition, and then, from 1915 to 1918, was transferred to staff duty with the Guards Cavalry Division on the Western Front. Which is to say, he spent the meat of the war sitting at a desk, processing the administrative and operational machinery of a modern industrial army, learning how to move masses of men and materiel by paper and wire rather than by saber and bugle. The comparison I keep reaching for when thinking about what this transition meant for Kleist is the experience of the United States cavalry in the same period, and I want to be clear about where it breaks down, because the break is genuinely instructive. American cavalry officers who survived the First World War and the interwar period, men like Ardennes Chaffee Jr., who would later command U.S. armored forces, faced an identical identity crisis. The arm that had defined them was dying, and the question was whether they could translate their cavalry instincts into the vocabulary of internal combustion. The parallel holds at the individual level. Where it breaks down is institutional. The U.S. Army's transition to armor was hampered by a legal provision in the National Defense Act of 1920 that specifically prohibited the cavalry branch from operating tanks. That was infantry's job. And the resulting inter-service turf war slowed American armored development for nearly 2 decades. The German transition had its own obstacles, but they were primarily financial and political rather than legalistic. German cavalry officers weren't prohibited from thinking about tanks. They were prohibited by treaty from building them, which, as it turned out, made them think about them harder. The November 1918 armistice found Kleist at 37, a professional soldier with a useless arm designation, and an army being dismantled by the treaty process that was about to transform it beyond recognition. What he did next is not what most accounts emphasize. He didn't go home. He joined the Freikorps. Specifically, he joined the Iron Division, the Eisern Division, and fought in the Baltic states as part of the chaotic, Weimar-sanctioned, semi-authorized military presence that Germany maintained in Latvia and Estonia through 1919. In June of that year, he personally led an attack group during the Battle of Chasis, a decisive engagement in the Latvian and Estonian Wars of Independence. This detail matters. The Battle of Chasis is still commemorated in Latvia as a founding moment of national independence. It's Victory Day in the Latvian calendar. And the German officer commanding the attacking force on the losing side of that battle was the man who would, 22 years later, drive a Panzer army 500 kilometers into the Soviet Union. I first made this connection when I was reading a completely different subject. I was looking at the post-war careers of French officers in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. And I noticed how many of them filtered through colonial campaigns in North Africa and Indochina in the 1880s and 90s, before reappearing in senior command positions in 1914. The career mechanism was the same. An army that can't fight the war it was built for redirects its officer corps toward conflicts at the margin, lesser campaigns, colonial operations, border wars, that maintain professional identity and operational practice while the political situation back home stabilizes. The Freikorps Baltic campaigns were Germany's colonial margin equivalent in 1919. They weren't glorious, they weren't decisive. They kept professional soldiers in uniform and in the habit of command when every other option was being legally stripped away. The Versailles Treaty, signed on the 28th of June 1919, capped the German army at 100,000 officers and men, from a wartime peak that had mobilized more than 13 million. The officer corps that survived this reduction was necessarily one of the most concentrated bodies of professional military knowledge in history. Every man retained had been selected, vetted, and was acutely aware of his own institutional value. From 1920 onward, Kleist was one of these men, absorbed into the Reichswehr, assigned first as a staff officer with the 13th Cavalry Regiment, then as a tactics instructor at the Hanover Cavalry School from 1924 to 1928, then as chief of staff to 2 cavalry divisions in Breslau and Berlin. He was building the intellectual infrastructure of a military that technically didn't yet know what form it would take. The Hanover Cavalry School in the mid-1920s was not, on its surface, a revolutionary institution. It taught riding, it taught cavalry tactics, it taught the handling of mounted formations in the field. But buried in its curriculum, in the section called Gefecht der verbundenen Waffen, Combined Arms Combat, was a set of problem sets that kept returning to a specific scenario. A mobile force breaking through a fixed defensive position and exploiting deep into the enemy's operational rear before the defending side could reorient its reserves. The scenario was, ostensibly, a cavalry problem. The cavalry was the mobile force. The breakthrough was the cavalry charge. But anyone looking at the map exercises honestly could see that the scenario was indifferent to the specific arm executing it. The scenario was about speed, about surprise, about the disruption of the enemy's decision cycle. The horse was a placeholder. Kleist taught this curriculum for approximately 4 years, from 1924 to 1928, and what he was doing, without necessarily understanding it in exactly these terms, was rehearsing 1940. The intellectual context matters here because it's been systematically oversimplified in popular history. The usual story of Blitzkrieg's development is a story about Heinz Guderian, the prophet in the wilderness, writing Achtung Panzer and forcing an unwilling establishment to accept armored doctrine. This story is substantially true but structurally incomplete. Guderian was the theorist and the advocate, but the officers who would actually command the formations, Kleist, Hoppner, Reinhardt, Hoth, were not Guderian's students. They were cavalry officers who had arrived at similar conclusions through a different route, and the Hanover Cavalry School was one of the nodes where those conclusions were being workshopped. The Auftragstaktik principle, mission command, the idea that subordinate commanders should be given objectives rather than methods and trusted to find their own solutions, was not a new idea in the 1920s. It was the doctrinal formalization of how cavalry had always had to fight, fast, out of contact with higher headquarters, making decisions in the moment. Kleist didn't invent mission command. He was its practitioner and teacher, and when it was later applied to tank formations, it worked because the cognitive structure was already there. By 1928, Kleist had moved from instructor to chief of staff of the 2nd Cavalry Division in Breslau. From 1929 to 1931, he held the same position at the 3rd Division in Berlin. In 1931, he was promoted to colonel and given command of the 9th Infantry Regiment in Potsdam, a deliberate cross-arm posting that placed a cavalry-trained staff officer in charge of an infantry formation at the precise moment when the Reichswehr was beginning its first serious internal debates about motorized infantry, the units that would eventually become the Panzer Grenadier, who gave armored formations their staying power. He was being moved around the institutional board in a pattern that, in retrospect, reads as preparation for combined arms command. The comparison that illuminates this period is not German, it's British. The British Army in the 1920s and early 30s had its own group of officers thinking through the same problems: J.F.C. Fuller, Basil Little Hart, Percy Hobart, and their theoretical output was, in some respects, ahead of anything being developed in Germany. Fuller's Plan 1919, developed during the war itself, had proposed using concentrated armor to paralyze enemy command and communication rather than engage frontline infantry directly, and Liddell Hart had refined this into a comprehensive theory of mechanized warfare that was being read and cited by German officers throughout the interwar period. The parallel breaks down at the institutional level. The British Army had the theorists, but didn't listen to them. The Royal Tank Corps remained subordinate to infantry and cavalry interests. Hobart was effectively forced out of his command in 1939. The German army lacked the equivalent theorists. Guderian came later and built on foreign foundations, but it had a cavalry officer class that had already internalized the operational instincts those theorists described, and it had a bureaucratic crisis of institutional survival that made military innovation a necessity rather than a luxury. They were solving the same problem from different ends. What reading the Reichswehr curriculum documents alongside the British interwar development literature made me realize is that the error wasn't tactical on either side. It was doctrinal. Both armies understood that armor changed warfare. One army built institutions to contain that change and manage it carefully. The other built institutions to exploit it, even if doing so meant overriding traditions it officially claimed to venerate. The German cavalry school that produced Kleist was institutionally conservative. It still ran riding courses, still taught saber drill, but it had buried in its curriculum a set of operational assumptions that were not conservative at all. The future wasn't announced. It was hidden inside the past. The Kama Tank School, established near Kazan in Soviet Russia under a 1926 agreement extending the military provisions of the Rapallo Treaty, was the most important single facility in the development of German armored doctrine, and it was operated on foreign soil in secret precisely because it couldn't be operated on German soil legally. From 1929 to 1933, German officers traveled to Kazan, studied tank tactics, drove prototype vehicles, and brought their findings back to Germany in reports classified at the highest level. Kleist was at the Hanover Cavalry School during the early years of Kama's operation. not at Kazan himself. But the officers who were at Kazan, and the findings they brought back, fed directly into the curriculum debates he was participating in at Hanover. The Soviet Union was, with no appreciation of the irony, helping assemble the operational mind of the army that would nearly destroy it 12 years later. By 1932, Kleist was commanding the 2nd Cavalry Division and had been promoted to Major General. In October of that year, he received a divisional command that, by the old standards of his class, represented everything a Kleist son was supposed to achieve. He was also, by this point, a convinced monarchist in a Germany that was about to elect a chancellor who would make monarchy permanently impossible. He was devoutly Protestant, a member of the Order of St. John, named a Knight of Justice in 1935 by Prince Oscar of Prussia, the last functioning representative of the Hohenzollern House in German public life. His political world was not the Nazi world. It was older, quieter, and increasingly powerless. He could see the regime clearly. He just couldn't see a way to stop it that didn't cost him the only identity he had. There's a line in Leon Goldenson's interview notes from 1946. Goldenson was the U.S. Army psychiatrist assigned to monitor the mental health of German witnesses and defendants at Nuremberg, where Kleist describes being forced to listen to the proclamation of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935 as a great humiliation. He uses the word once, without elaboration. Goldenson, trained to notice what his subjects chose to emphasize and what they elided, apparently did not press him further. The phrase sits there in the transcript, a great humiliation, doing exactly what such carefully chosen phrases do in self-justifying testimony. It positions the speaker as a victim of the ideological moment rather than a participant in it. It acknowledges the offense without specifying the response, and it substitutes emotional language for the harder question of what, precisely, a senior general officer did in response to the humiliation he felt. What Kleist did, in response to the proclamation of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, was continue his command. He was, at this point, commanding the Military District 8 responsible for Silesia and simultaneously commanding the 8th Army Corps, a significant regional power position. He had been promoted to General of the Cavalry on the 1st of August 1936. His army was in the process of being rebuilt, re-equipped, and ideologically reoriented by a regime he found personally offensive, and he was a key instrument of that rebuilding process. The humiliation, whatever its psychological depth, did not produce resignation. It produced accommodation. That's not a moral verdict. It's a structural observation about how institutions convert private dissent into public compliance. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair of February 1938 is usually presented in military histories as a leadership crisis or a political scandal. It was both of those things, but it was also something more specific. A systematic, surgical removal of the old conservative Offizierskorps establishment from senior command. Werner von Blomberg, the war minister, was compromised by his marriage to a woman with a police record. Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, was targeted with fabricated evidence of a charge that was grotesque by any standard. Both were removed. In the same restructuring, 16 senior generals were retired and 44 others reassigned. Hitler simultaneously abolished the war ministry and created the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, under his own direct command. In a single administrative action in early February 1938, he became not just the political leader of Germany, but its supreme military commander, and the officer class that had quietly harbored reservations about him lost its institutional voice. Kleist was dismissed in this purge, but the grounds are worth examining carefully, because they reveal both the precision and the cynicism of Hitler's targeting. The official reason was his monarchist attitudes, his publicly known sympathy for the restoration of the House of Hohenzollern. Kleist's own post-war account to Goldenson emphasized something different, that he had spoken out too loudly in favor of Christianity and the Church. Both reasons appear in the historical record, and Mitchum's biography assigns primary weight to the monarchism. I believe the monarchism was the administrative cause, and the Christianity was the cultural context. What Hitler was actually removing was a specific type of German officer, aristocratic, Protestant, pre-Nazi, with social networks running through the old Hohenzollern establishment rather than through the party. Kleist was not alone. He was a member of a category, and that category was being eliminated. He received a significant departing honor upon his forced retirement, authorization to wear the uniform of the 8th Cavalry Regiment. This is the kind of institutional courtesy that makes clear that even in the act of being dismissed, you're expected to behave as though the institution still respects you. Kleist accepted it. He subsequently acquired a property near Breslau and withdrew from public military life. He was 56 years old. He was, by his own account, humiliated. He was also free, for the first time in his adult life, of institutional obligation. He could, theoretically, have used that freedom to resist more actively. His cousin, Ewald von Kleist, was at this time already in contact with the nascent German resistance to Hitler, participating in the conservative circles that would eventually produce the July Plot of 1944. I want to sit with this comparison for a moment, because it matters. Ewald von Kleist was not a soldier. He was a political activist, a committed conservative monarchist who had, as early as 1933, written a pamphlet called National Socialism, a Danger, that he distributed at personal risk. He was arrested repeatedly by the Gestapo, released through aristocratic networks, and continued his opposition until it killed him in April 1945. Paul von Kleist, his cousin, shared his surname, his faith, his politics, and his hostility to National Socialism. What separated them was not belief, it was action, and the institutional identity that made action feel impossible. A field marshal's identity is defined by command. A man without a command, dismissed, retired, his uniform no longer officially relevant, has no institutional anchor for the version of himself that the family and the Kriegsakademie and the cavalry school had spent 50 years constructing. Resistance, for Kleist, would have required first dismantling that identity, and there is no evidence he ever seriously attempted to do so. He did not, however, volunteer to come back. He was recalled. In September 1939, as Germany invaded Poland, Hitler's Wehrmacht suddenly needed experienced corps commanders, and ideology was briefly secondary to competence. The phone call came. Kleist answered it. And with that answer, undocumented, unremarked, simply the institutional logic of a man picking up a telephone, the entire moral catastrophe of his subsequent career begins. The Polish campaign of September 1939 lasted 27 days. It's been analyzed exhaustively as the first demonstration of Blitzkrieg at operational scale. And that analysis isn't wrong, but it tends to produce the impression of a perfectly functioning mechanism delivering precisely its theoretical output. The mechanism had rattles. The logistics wobbled. The roads of southern Poland were not the roads that German supply planning had used as its baseline. And Kleist's 22nd Motorized Corps, attacking on the southern wing of Army Group South under von Rundstedt, consumed fuel at rates that the forward supply columns couldn't consistently match. The vehicle maintenance logs, which survive in fragments in the Bundesarchiv record, show transmission wear and road damage attrition running ahead of pre-campaign estimates from the second week onward. It worked, but it worked the way an aircraft with a slightly rough engine works. Well enough to land, not well enough to assume the engine will always be fine. The 22nd Motorized Corps wasn't yet a Panzer formation in the 1940 sense. It included motorized infantry, anti-tank elements, and artillery moving on wheels rather than tracks, with only limited organic armored capability. What it had was Kleist's command method, the same method he'd been teaching at Hanover for 4 years, which prioritized speed, bypass, and exploitation over grinding attrition. In his post-war Goldenson interview, Kleist described applying cavalry tactics with his motorized units, meaning deep penetration and flank disruption rather than frontal assault on prepared positions. The Polish army, built around a strategic doctrine that assumed its flanks were anchored by Allied pressure from France in the west, was not designed to respond to a threat that materialized behind its lines before its reserves could reorient. Kleist's corps broke through the southern wing and drove east, and Poland ceased to have an effective southern front within 10 days. The comparison I reach for here is the French experience at Sedan in 1870, and I want to be specific about what makes it useful and what makes it misleading. In August of 1870, the Prussian Third Army and the Army of the Meuse encircled the French army of Chalon at Sedan, forcing the surrender of Napoleon III and approximately 83,000 French soldiers in a single day. The operational structure, envelopment from multiple axes, exploitation of a command system that couldn't process simultaneous threats, bears a strong family resemblance to what Kleist's corps was practicing in Poland 69 years later. The parallel breaks down on one crucial point. In 1870, the encirclement was achieved over days of converging movement by large formations. In 1939, it was achieved in hours by mechanized units operating ahead of their own supply lines. The compression of time was not merely an incremental improvement on the 1870 model. It was a qualitative change that made a different kind of psychological shock possible, because no command system, not even a competent one, could process a threat moving at 40 kilometers per hour toward its rear. What Kleist understood, and what his Goldensohn testimony confirms obliquely, was that the Polish campaign had validated the concept while exposing the limits of the vehicle. The fuel consumption problem was real. The road damage attrition was real. And the Soviet observation of these events, Kleist noted Soviet forces entering eastern Poland on the 17th of September and assessed them positively, remarking on their surprising extent of motorization, good behavior, and advanced military technique, was a data point that should have triggered a serious reassessment of what a future war against the USSR would require. It didn't. The operational success of the Polish campaign was so complete and so far ahead of what even German planners had privately projected that the system's internal warning mechanisms were essentially overridden by the sheer noise of victory. Kurt Zeitzler, who served as Kleist's chief of staff in Poland and would later become chief of the Army General Staff, was the organizational nerve center of the 22nd Corps. The chief of staff role in German operational formations was not a secondary command position. It was effectively a co-command, responsible for translating the commanding general's operational intent into executable orders, tracking the logistics state, maintaining communications with higher headquarters, and identifying problems before they became crises. Zeitzler's presence in this role alongside Kleist established a working relationship and a staff method that would continue into France, and the quality of that partnership, the precision of the command and control mechanism between the two men, was as important to the 22nd Corps' performance as any tactical decision Kleist made directly. Military history focuses on commanders. It should focus more on their chiefs of staff. The Soviet forces Kleist encountered in eastern Poland on the 17th of September were entering as co-occupiers under the terms of the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed the previous August. The two armies, Wehrmacht and Red Army, shared space across a demarcation line, exchanged formal courtesies, and briefly coexisted in a situation with no modern equivalent except perhaps the joint occupation zones of post-war Germany. Kleist met the Red Army here in a state of technical truce, and what he saw, motorized formations, organized logistics, equipment he described as modern and capable, was the intelligence assessment he subsequently reported upward. The Wehrmacht's intelligence system noted his observations. The OKH planning process that was already beginning to outline what would become Operation Barbarossa treated them as a manageable variable. 21 months later, Kleist would drive his tanks through those same formations and discover that a manageable variable and a catastrophic underestimate can look identical until the moment they diverge. The formation order for Panzergruppe Kleist, issued in April of 1940, assigned to the new command structure 3 corps: General Wiedersheim's 14th Corps, motorized, General Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps, and General Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, along with supporting elements that brought the total vehicle count to 41,440. The document is a masterpiece of bureaucratic confidence. It lists formations, assigns boundaries, specifies routes of march and communications frequencies, and details fuel allocation protocols. What it does not contain is a chapter on how an operational headquarters that had never existed before should coordinate, in real time under combat conditions, 3 Panzer Corps commanded by 3 officers, each of whom had strong opinions about how armored warfare should be conducted, and only one of whom, Guderian, had spent the previous decade publicly articulating those opinions in print. Managing 41,000 vehicles and their associated fuel, ammunition, and maintenance requirements was the technical problem. Managing Guderian was the human one. The Panzergruppe as an organizational concept was genuinely novel. Previous armored operations, Poland, the German interwar exercises, had been conducted at the corps level, with panzer and motorized formations assigned to army commands that were primarily infantry in character and mindset. The Panzergruppe was the first attempt to create an operational-level headquarters specifically designed for the command of multiple armored corps operating in coordination. It required a new type of communications architecture, a new logistics philosophy, and a new command culture that understood the difference between directing fast-moving mechanized formations and the plodding timetables of traditional army-level coordination. Kleist had none of this by training. Nobody did. He assembled it from first principles under operational conditions, which is simultaneously how most military innovations actually happen and a genuinely terrifying way to run an army. On the 10th of May 1940, Panzergruppe Kleist entered the Ardennes forest. The column of 41,000 vehicles stretched for approximately 250 kilometers bumper to bumper, a traffic jam of historic proportions, fully visible from the air, sitting essentially stationary through the night of the 10th and 11th as units waited for the roads ahead to clear. Allied air reconnaissance photographed it. The Luftwaffe's air superiority prevented any significant Allied interdiction. But there's a more important point about those photographs that tends to get lost in the operational narrative. Senior French commanders who saw the reconnaissance reports genuinely didn't believe what they were looking at. General Gamelin's staff interpreted the Ardennes column as a feint, or as a secondary supply movement, because French operational doctrine held that the Ardennes was tank impenetrable, and therefore no rational commander would concentrate his armored forces there. The traffic jam was hiding in plain sight, protected not by camouflage, but by the enemy's institutional assumptions. Before Kleist's corps crossed the Meuse, he and Guderian had a documented dispute about the precise location of the crossing. Kleist wanted to strike further west at Flies, arguing this would avoid a double river crossing and would hit the boundary between the French 9th and 2nd armies, always a vulnerable seam in any defensive line. Guderian disagreed, and his counter-argument was specific. A thrust toward Flies would bring the advance within range of the fortress artillery at Charleville-Mézières, roughly 25 kilometers northwest of Sedan, and the regrouping required would delay the crossing by 24 hours, time enough for the French to bring up reserves. Kleist was persuaded. This exchange is documented by Karl-Heinz Frieser in The Blitzkrieg Legend, drawing on German operational records, and Frieser's analysis supports Guderian's tactical judgment as correct. But what's interesting is not who was right. What's interesting is that this conversation, about specific crossing points and specific artillery ranges, happened between a corps commander and his superior at the operational headquarters level. The planning was that granular. The Auftragstaktik principle, which delegated tactical decision-making to subordinate commanders, coexisted with an operational process that was simultaneously highly centralized in its planning and highly decentralized in its execution. Kleist held both ends of that tension. The comparison that runs alongside the Ardennes breakthrough, and which I find genuinely illuminating on its own terms, rather than as a simple parallel, is the Japanese operation through the Malayan Peninsula in December 1941 and January 1942. General Yamashita's 25th Army drove down the peninsula using a combination of speed, aggressive bypassing of fortified positions, and the exploitation of a defending command system that consistently underestimated both the pace of the advance and the direction from which the next threat would come. The structural DNA of the Malayan campaign, the prioritization of tempo over security, the deliberate targeting of the enemy's decision cycle rather than his front line, the use of mechanized speed to create tactical situations that the defense could not process before they became irreversible, is recognizably the same as what Panzergruppe Kleist did in the Ardennes. The break in the comparison is important. Yamashita was operating against a colonial defense built on racial assumptions about Japanese capability. Kleist was operating against a French army that had more tanks than Germany, more artillery, and was operating in its home territory. The Japanese parallel explains the method. The French situation explains how extraordinary it was that the method worked. On the 17th of May, 5 days after the Meuse crossing at Sedan, Kleist issued a halt order to Guderian's corps. Guderian responded by requesting permission to resign his command. The exchange, documented in operational records and Guderian's own post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, has been used ever since as evidence of Guderian's boldness and Kleist's timidity. I think that reading is too simple, and I want to explain why. On the 17th of May, Panzergruppe Kleist's northern flank was completely exposed, running along the Aisne River line with no significant friendly forces between it and the bulk of the French army to the south. The fuel state of the leading divisions was, by logistics records, running below the safety margin for continued high-tempo operations. Allied armored reserves were unaccounted for, the Maginot Line formations were unengaged, and no one knew whether they were about to be committed against the corridor being opened. Kleist, responsible for 41,000 vehicles on a fuel tightrope with an open flank, issued a pause order. Guderian, looking forward at an operational void and what appeared to be a collapsing French command system, wanted to keep going. They were both right. They were operating from different information sets. The halt lasted roughly 1 day before Rundstedt mediated and the advance resumed. The miracle is not that there was a crisis. The miracle is that there was only one. There's something to be said about the Yugoslav campaign of April 1941 that almost every German-focused military history underemphasizes. And it's not a military point, it's a demographic one. Yugoslavia in April 1941 had a population of approximately 15 million people. By the end of 1945, approximately 1 million Yugoslav citizens were dead. Some killed by German and Italian occupation forces, a significant portion killed in the multi-sided civil war between partisans, Chetniks, and the Ustasha regime that the German invasion enabled. The invasion lasted 11 days. The suffering it generated lasted 4 years. Kleist's part in those 11 days was the operational spearhead, the Panzer group that drove from Bulgaria through Serbia and into Belgrade. But his part in the 4 years that followed is the harder thing to account for, because it's diffuse rather than direct, structural rather than personal. The specific operational achievement was the seizure of Belgrade on the 13th of April 1941 by forward elements of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group. The political context of that achievement was Operation Retribution, the German bombing of Belgrade on the 6th of April that preceded the ground advance by 1 week. The bombing employed approximately 484 aircraft and delivered an estimated 360 metric tons of bombs on a city whose air defenses were essentially non-existent. The lowest credible casualty estimate is 2,271 civilian dead. Kleist himself, at his Yugoslav war crimes trial in 1946, testified that the bombing had a primarily political terrorist character and had nothing to do with the war. That air bombing was a matter of Hitler's vanity and his personal revenge. This is Kleist's most unguarded statement in any post-war record. He described a war crime committed by his own side's air force in unmistakable terms, without euphemism. He had recognized it as a war crime at the time. He commanded the follow-on force that entered the bombed city. Both of these things are documented, and they coexist in the same man. The comparison that runs alongside Yugoslavia 1941 is not another military campaign. It's a legal framework, specifically the development of the concept of command responsibility in the simultaneous Allied proceedings against Japanese commanders in the Pacific. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, tried by an American military tribunal in Manila in late 1945, was convicted and executed on the principle that a commander is responsible for atrocities committed by forces under his command if he knew or should have known about them and failed to prevent or punish them. The Yamashita Standard, as it came to be called, was being adjudicated at almost exactly the same time as Kleist was providing his testimony at Nuremberg and Yugoslavia. What I find instructive in the comparison is the gap between how the two commanders were treated. Yamashita was executed. Kleist received 15 years. The difference is not primarily about the severity of the crimes involved. It's about the different prosecutorial and political contexts, and about the degree to which the Western Allied tribunals were simultaneously trying to establish universal legal principles and manage the practical necessity of working with German military expertise in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. The 11 days of the Yugoslav campaign left Kleist promoted. He'd received his General of the Cavalry rank in July 1940, and after Yugoslavia, he was carrying the weight of 2 successful campaigns under his command belt. He was 59 years old and about to be given something no German officer had ever commanded: an entire Panzer army, redesignated from Panzer Group to 1st Panzer Army, preparing for the largest land invasion in military history. What's notable about his professional trajectory at this point is how completely it had absorbed the institutional damage of his 1938 dismissal. He'd been recalled, given a corps, given a Panzergruppe, given an army. The machinery of Wehrmacht command had taken a monarchist Christian aristocrat who was too conservative for the regime, forced him out, then urgently re-employed him when operational need outweighed ideological preference. This is how competence functions inside authoritarian systems. It creates a demand the system can't afford to refuse, even when the person supplying it is someone the system would prefer to control or eliminate. The Yugoslav campaign also forced Kleist to think about something he hadn't needed to manage seriously in Poland or France: the politics of occupation. Yugoslavia wasn't a state that collapsed and ceased to be relevant. It was a state that fragmented into ethnic and political components, each of which immediately began reconstituting itself as a belligerent. The Serbian population in particular was not going to accept German occupation passively. The first partisan units were forming within weeks of the invasion, and by the summer of 1941, German forces in Yugoslavia were already engaged in the kind of counter-guerrilla operations that would eventually consume hundreds of thousands of German, Italian, and Yugoslav lives. Kleist's army group moved on to the Soviet Union and left the Yugoslav problem to others, to the brutally efficient Hans Böhme and the reprisal policies that became the operational norm. But he'd seen enough in those 11 days to know that military speed and political resolution were not the same thing. It was a lesson he would apply, perfectly and belatedly, in the Caucasus a year later. By June of 1941, Kleist was commanding approximately 600 tanks, 100,000 motorized troops, and the supporting elements of the 1st Panzer Group, the designation it carried when Barbarossa began. He was 60 years old. He had commanded successfully at every level from corps to army group equivalent. He had won in Poland, in France, and in Yugoslavia against 3 very different opponents using 3 recognizably similar methods. He was about to discover that the 4th opponent had been watching all 3, had drawn its own conclusions, and was not going to be kind about what it had learned. When Kleist's 1st Panzer Group crossed the Soviet frontier in the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941, it did so as part of the largest land invasion ever assembled. More than 3 million German and Axis troops moving against a front stretching approximately 2,900 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. From the south, the number matters. The entire Eastern Army, the Ostheer, had counted more than 3 million men, 3,350 tanks, and roughly 600,000 motor vehicles on its establishment rolls at the campaign's opening. Kleist's command, the 1st Panzer Group operating under Army Group South, was assigned the most tactically demanding axis of advance, straight through the heavily mechanized belt of the Soviet Southwestern Military District, which held the highest concentration of armored formations of any sector on the front. He was driving east. The densest tank force the Red Army possessed was driving west to meet him. The first week of Barbarossa on the southern axis was, before anything else, a collision. The Battle of Brody, fought between the 23rd and 30th of June, is still the largest tank engagement in the history of warfare by numbers of armored vehicles engaged. Approximately 6,000 tanks involved across both sides, though the figure varies depending on how you count vehicles that broke down before reaching contact. 5 Soviet mechanized corps, including the 4th, 8th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd, threw themselves against Kleist's advancing columns in a series of counterattacks that were individually ferocious and collectively uncoordinated. The Dupuy Institute's analysis of the battle places total Soviet tank losses at approximately 2,471 vehicles destroyed, damaged, or broken down across the engagement. German losses at Brody were estimated in the low hundreds. A ratio of roughly 12-1 in armored losses is, by any measure, a catastrophic defeat for the Soviet side. It was not, however, a failure of will or of individual bravery. It was a systemic failure of the command architecture that was supposed to make 5 mechanized corps into a coherent fighting force. What the Soviet after-action assessments from these weeks, fragmentary, bureaucratically honest in their way, consistently document is the same problem. Radio equipment had not been distributed below corps level in most formations, which meant tank battalions and companies had to coordinate by runner, by flag, or by physical proximity. Corps drove into German lines without knowing where their flanking formations were. Units that should have converged on the same point arrived sequentially rather than simultaneously, presenting Kleist's anti-tank and Panzer screens with a series of isolated engagements rather than the overwhelming mass that would have been genuinely dangerous. I first made this connection when reading something entirely different, a study of the British Expeditionary Force's signals failures at Dunkirk in 1940, and then went back to the Brody material and found the same structural pattern. Not incompetence at the individual level, but a communications architecture that couldn't support the tempo the doctrine required. The parallel holds tightly up to the point where it breaks. The British at Dunkirk were executing a retreat. The Soviets at Brody were trying to execute a counteroffensive. The difference in what a signals failure costs you in those two contexts is the difference between a hard withdrawal and an annihilation. By early July, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group had claimed 10,872 prisoners and 1,655 tanks destroyed or captured from the beginning of the campaign to that point, per the Axis History Forum's analysis of the operational record. Those numbers were growing daily. The campaign was barely 2 weeks old. In the same period, the 1st Panzer Group had itself lost a significant fraction of its operational tank strength. The pace of the advance, the road conditions, the mechanical demands of continuous movement, and the growing intensity of Soviet resistance were all grinding the Panzer force down at a rate that German logistics planning had not anticipated, because German logistics planning had been based on the assumption that the Soviet military would collapse within 8 weeks. It was not collapsing. It was being destroyed. The distinction, one a calculation about institutional failure, the other a brute statement about attrition, mattered enormously for what came next. The T-34 was the data point that refused to fit the pre-campaign assessment. Kleist's post-war assessment to Basil Little Hart, that Soviet equipment was very good even in 1941, and that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world, was not retrospective generosity. It was a statement he appears to have held from first contact. The German standard anti-tank weapon of 1941, the 3.7-centimeter PaK-36, fired a projectile that could not reliably penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at any tactically useful range. The T-34's whole front was armored at 45 millimeters, set at a 60-degree slope, which effectively tripled its ballistic resistance relative to a vertical plate of the same thickness. The only German weapon in general service that could kill a T-34 from the front with confidence was the 8.8-centimeter flak gun, which was a heavy anti-aircraft weapon pressed into emergency anti-tank use and could not be positioned at the forward edge of a moving armored advance with any consistency. Kleist knew this in the first fortnight. The Wehrmacht's procurement machinery would not produce a tank capable of frontally killing a T-34 at normal combat ranges until the Panzer V Panther arrived in service in the summer of 1943, 2 years after the problem was first identified at the highest levels of command. The Uman encirclement of July and early August 1941 was Kleist's first large-scale pocket, the operational template that would define Army Group South's summer and autumn. The 1st Panzer Group broke through the Soviet Southern Front's lines and drove south and east to encircle the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies in the area southeast of Uman. When the pocket was liquidated on the 8th of August, approximately 103,000 prisoners had been taken from inside it. The commanders of both encircled armies, General Lieutenant Muzichenko of the 6th and General Major Ponedelin of the 12th, were among the captured. It was, at that point, the most successful German encirclement of the Southern Campaign, and it established a pattern that would be repeated, with diminishing German resources and growing Soviet resistance across the next 3 months. The Kiev encirclement of September 1941 is the largest battle of encirclement in the recorded history of warfare. By the time the pocket was closed and cleared, German statistics placed Soviet losses at approximately 665,000 prisoners, 824 tanks, and 3,018 guns captured or destroyed. Some post-war Soviet analyses place the prisoner figure somewhat lower, around 450,000 to 480,000. But even the conservative figures are numbers that dwarf any other single encirclement in modern military history. The encirclement required 2 panzer groups to close a pocket spanning roughly 1,000 square kilometers east of the Ukrainian capital, executed over a period of approximately 6 weeks, and it was produced by a strategic decision: Hitler's insistence on the Kiev encirclement over a continued drive on Moscow, that Guderian, Halder, and most of the senior German operational staff considered a strategic error. Kleist, for his part, had simply been ordered to turn his 1st Panzer Group north from its axis of advance in central Ukraine and drive toward Romny, where it would link with Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group driving south from the Smolensk area. On the 16th of September, the 2 panzer groups linked up east of Kiev. The pocket was sealed. What the operational record shows about Kleist's role specifically is the distance his formation covered to complete the encirclement: a northward turn from central Ukraine against Soviet resistance over terrain that alternated between open steppe and forested river valleys, covering several hundred kilometers in roughly 10 days. The 1st Panzer Group, by September, was operating at well below its June starting strength in tanks. The Army Group Center Operational Readiness Study, which focuses on the central axis but offers comparative data for the south, shows tank operational rates declining significantly across all panzer groups by late summer, with some formations reporting fewer than 40% of their establishment tanks as operationally ready by early September. Kleist was completing the most geographically ambitious encirclement of the war, with a panzer force running at perhaps half its campaign opening capability. The fact that it worked reflects a genuine tactical and operational excellence. It does not reflect sustainable military power. The comparison I find most useful here, and I want to be honest about where it breaks, is the Japanese encirclement of the British forces on Singapore in February 1942. General Yamashita's 25th Army, after driving down the Malayan Peninsula in approximately 70 days, achieved the surrender of approximately 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops at Singapore, a figure roughly comparable to, though smaller than, the Kiev prisoner catch. The structural parallel is the exploitation of an opponent whose command system was reacting to the previous threat rather than the current one. In both cases, the defender was so focused on the axis of advance that the encircling movement succeeded almost before it was recognized as such. The break in the parallel is decisive. Singapore's fall represented the terminal collapse of British military power in Southeast Asia, from which it never recovered in that theater. Kiev's fall represented a massive defeat for the Soviet Southwest Front, but the Soviet army immediately began reconstituting. Within weeks, new formations were being committed to the line east of the encirclement. The Red Army's capacity to absorb catastrophic tactical defeats and regenerate operational formations was qualitatively different from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in France or Yugoslavia. And after Kiev, the pace of German strategic decision-making began to lose its synchronization with operational reality. By the 1st of October 1941, the 1st Panzer Group, redesignated the 1st Panzer Army on that date, reflecting its growing establishment, was sweeping south from its Kiev axis toward the Sea of Azov. The Battle of the Sea of Azov, which began on the 26th of September with a Soviet offensive operation by the Southern Front and ended with Kleist's counter-encirclement of the Soviet 9th and 18th Armies near Melitopol, yielded further Soviet losses and demonstrated again the operational pattern that had characterized the entire summer. Kleist's armor moving faster and deeper than the Soviet command system could process, closing pockets before defensive reorientation was possible. By the 11th of October, both Soviet armies had been effectively destroyed, and the 1st Panzer Army held the Donbass. The army then turned east along the Sea of Azov shore toward Rostov, the city at the Don's mouth, the last geographic barrier before the Caucasus. What the army was consuming to achieve these results is the number that keeps demanding attention. The 1st Panzer Army's fuel requirements, moving at operational tempo, ran to several hundred metric tons per day. Its ammunition expenditure was accumulating well beyond the established resupply baselines, and its tank strength, which had been declining since June, was not being replenished at a rate that matched combat loss. The German supply system delivering to the Southern Front was operating at or beyond its designed capacity for the entire autumn. Using a combination of rail lines, many of them converted from the Russian broad gauge to the European standard gauge under combat conditions, and motorized truck columns that were themselves burning the fuel they were trying to deliver. This is the arithmetic of culmination, an offensive that is outrunning its own logistical basis, where every additional kilometer of advance simultaneously extends the supply line and reduces the force available to advance it. On the 17th of November 1941, the 1st Panzer Army forced its way across the Meuse River and launched its assault on Rostov. The temperature at the front was approximately minus 15 degrees Celsius. Significant portions of the army were still wearing summer uniforms. The Panzer III and IV tanks operating in this environment faced a mechanical problem that had been documented since the previous winter in Norway, but never adequately resolved. The lubricating oils used in their drivetrains and transmissions were rated to approximately minus 10 degrees Celsius, below which gear changes required physical intervention and cold start ignition became unreliable without preheating equipment that most forward units didn't have. The T-34, by contrast, used a diesel power plant with a broader cold weather operational envelope and a compressed air starting system that was substantially more reliable in extreme cold. Kleist had assessed Soviet equipment as superior a full 5 months earlier. The army he was leading into Rostov was running on borrowed mechanical endurance. The city fell on the 21st of November. 4 days later, on the 27th, the Soviet Southern Front launched its counterattack, striking Kleist's dangerously extended northern flank with fresh formations that German intelligence had not adequately tracked. By the 2nd of December, Soviet forces had retaken Rostov, and the 1st Panzer Army was withdrawing to the Meuse River near Taganrog. It was the first significant German withdrawal of the war. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Army Group South's commander, ordered the withdrawal over Hitler's explicit instructions to hold. Hitler dismissed Rundstedt within days. The institutional message that dismissal sent, that recommending retreat was an act of professional self-destruction, regardless of its military logic, was absorbed by every senior Wehrmacht commander, including Kleist. He would spend the next 2.5 years navigating the increasingly narrow corridor between military necessity and Hitler's hold-fast ideology, and Rostov was where that corridor first became visible. 1942 opened on the southern front, with the armies largely static behind the Meuse line, both sides exhausted, both sides reconstituting. For Kleist's 1st Panzer Army, the winter was a period of refitting, replenishing, and absorbing replacement personnel who had not experienced the preceding 6 months of attrition. The Soviet winter counteroffensive, most famous for its near approach to Moscow in the north, had also pushed against Army Group South's positions along the Meuse line through December and January, maintaining pressure that the 1st Panzer Army absorbed and held but did not repel with any decisive counter-movement. The front had achieved a kind of glacial stability that both sides understood was temporary. The German summer offensive of 1942, what would become Case Blue, was already being planned in OKH, and one of its preliminary conditions was the elimination of a dangerous Soviet salient that had been driven into the German line near Barvenkovo on the Izium axis, a salient that represented, if properly exploited, a potential Soviet springboard for an offensive against Kharkov. The Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942, and specifically the German Operation Fredericus that destroyed the Soviet Barvenkovo salient, is Kleist's cleanest single tactical achievement of the war. It's also one of the most consistently underdescribed in popular histories, precisely because it was immediately overshadowed by Case Blue and then entirely eclipsed by Stalingrad. On the 17th of May, the 1st Panzer Army attacked the southern face of the Barvenkovo salient, the forward Soviet position that had been driven into the German line during the winter. The attack achieved a penetration of approximately 10 kilometers on the first day, using the 16th Panzer Division as the leading element, hitting the Soviet line at its most vulnerable point before the Soviet offensive that was already underway in the north could generate enough momentum to offset the threat to its base. On the 19th of May, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army struck from the north. The salient's base was pinched off. Marshal Timoshenko, commanding the Soviet forces, recognized the threat and requested permission from Stalin to cancel the offensive and begin withdrawal. Stalin refused. This decision, made in Moscow, based on an assessment of the offensive momentum that was already irrelevant to the tactical reality at the salient's base, condemned both the attacking and the defending Soviet formations to destruction in a pocket. By the 28th of May, when the last Soviet resistance inside the Barvenkovo encirclement was eliminated, the total German claim was 240,000 prisoners, and the destruction or capture of over 1,250 Soviet tanks and approximately 2,000 artillery pieces. Antony Beevor's Stalingrad, drawing on the available German operational figures, confirms the prisoner count at approximately 240,000. It was the most efficient ratio of German operational effort to Soviet loss in any encirclement of the war. 11 days, limited German casualties, and the Soviet 6th and 57th Armies effectively ceased to exist as combat formations. I want to dwell on the operational timing of Fredericus because it contains a lesson about Soviet command decision-making that would be directly relevant to Stalingrad 6 months later. Timoshenko had committed his offensive precisely because he believed the Wehrmacht's winter exhaustion had created a window of vulnerability, that German forces in the south were sufficiently depleted that a thrust toward Kharkov could succeed. He wasn't wrong about the German weakness. He was wrong about the tempo. Kleist's army had been resting and refitting since January. It was in better condition than Timoshenko's intelligence suggested. And Stalin's refusal to authorize withdrawal when the threat became visible replicated, on the Soviet side, exactly the institutional pathology that had paralyzed German command decision-making under Hitler's hold-fast orders. Both systems had criminalized the word retreat. Both systems had created a structural inability to recognize culmination in time to act on it. Barvenkovo showed the Wehrmacht benefiting from that Soviet pathology. Stalingrad would show the cost when it operated in the other direction. The comparison that maps most cleanly onto Frederikus, and the break in it is as instructive as the parallel, is the British Operation Crusader in the Western Desert in November and December of 1941. In Crusader, the British Eighth Army drove the Axis forces back from their Libyan positions in a 6-week campaign that recovered most of Cyrenaica, but failed to produce the decisive encirclement of Rommel's Africa Corps that its planners had intended. The parallel is in the gap between a tactically successful operation and a strategically decisive one. Frederikus destroyed Soviet forces at Barvenkovo with extraordinary efficiency, but left the Soviet Army's strategic reserve intact and failed to change the fundamental force balance on the southern front. The break in the comparison is that Crusader's failure to encircle Rommel didn't immediately create a condition for catastrophe. The Soviet failure at Barvenkovo directly shaped the conditions under which Case Blue would be launched, because the destruction of Soviet forces in the salient left the entire southern front temporarily naked. Kleist's clean tactical victory at Barvenkovo was the precondition for the German summer offensive, and the summer offensive, as its strategic premise rested on reaching and holding Caucasian oil fields, was built on foundations that were already, in the early summer of 1942, structurally compromised. What Kleist raised with Hitler before Case Blue was launched, and what Hitler dismissed, was a specific warning about the extended flanks. The operation as designed would drive Army Group A, including Kleist's 1st Panzer Army, deep into the Caucasus on an axis that stretched hundreds of kilometers south of the Don, while Army Group B and the Allied satellite armies covered the vast Don flank running from Voronezh southeast to Stalingrad. Kleist's objection, documented in his post-war interviews with Little Hart, was that Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian formations were being asked to hold the most exposed sectors of the flank, and that these armies lacked the anti-tank capability, the mechanized reserves, and the logistical coherence to hold against a determined Soviet offensive. Hitler told Kleist that those sectors were the easiest to hold. In November 1942, Operation Uranus would pierce those same sectors in a matter of hours. On the 28th of June 1942, Army Group South's summer offensive began rolling across the southern steppe in the largest and most spatially ambitious German operation of the war. Case Blue was designed around a fundamental economic argument. The Wehrmacht was consuming fuel at approximately 15% above its production and import capacity, and without the Caucasian oil fields, Maykop, Grozny, and ultimately Baku, the German war economy faced a fuel deficit that would steadily degrade every arm of its military power. This wasn't a projection of eventual risk, it was a current condition. The army going into the Caucasus was partly going there because without what it was going to find there, it couldn't keep fighting the way it had been fighting. The offensive was, beneath its strategic ambition, an act of metabolic desperation wearing the clothes of conquest. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army was the forward arm of Army Group A, the formation designated for the Caucasus thrust after Army Group South was divided into its 2 subgroups in mid-July. Army Group B, the other half, held the Stalingrad axis and the Don flank. Army Group A had Kleist's armor plus the 17th Army's infantry elements, and its assigned objectives ran from Rostov-on-Don, which fell again in late July 1942, south through the Kuban steppe, across the Caucasus mountain foothills, to Maykop and then Grozny, and theoretically to Baku. The linear distance from Rostov to Baku is approximately 1,200 kilometers. The supply line, measured back to the nearest functioning German railhead, grew with every day of advance. Kleist later described looking out from his command vehicle at the southern steppe, a flat, sunburned immensity extending to every horizon, and saying to his staff, "These vast spaces depress me, and these vast hordes of people. We're lost if we don't win them over." The remark, recorded by Nicholas O'Shaughnessy and others, is a rare moment of unguarded strategic despair from a commander who had spent 40 years learning not to show despair. The capture of Maykop on the 9th of August 1942 was, on its surface, an operational success. German armored units entered the city, the first Caucasian oil center on the list, having driven through several hundred kilometers of Soviet-held territory in approximately 6 weeks. What they found was not a functioning oil facility. Soviet engineers, working under direct NKVD supervision in the days before the German arrival, had executed one of the most comprehensive industrial sabotage operations of the war. Wells had been cemented, a process of pumping concrete slurry into the production casing, then detonating charges to collapse the perforated sections, at multiple depth points, destroying the structural integrity of the wellbore completely. Pumping equipment had been dismantled and evacuated or destroyed. Pipeline infrastructure had been severed at multiple points. The article published in the Past magazine's analysis of Case Blue notes that when German forces reached Maycop, the oil production figure from the captured field was less than 1,000 tons, against the field's pre-sabotage production rate, which British Ministry of Economic Warfare estimates had placed at approximately 18 million barrels per year from the Maycop-Grozny region combined. The Germans were not getting Caucasian oil. They were standing on top of cemented holes in the ground. The German petroleum engineers from Deutsche Mineralölgesellschaft, who were brought forward to assess restoration timelines, one of the odder footnotes of the Eastern Front, the site of civilian oil engineers working in a combat zone, delivered assessments that ranged from difficult to impossible in the timeframes that Case Blue's planners had assumed. The sabotage was categorized as too thorough for rapid repair. Complete re-drilling from the surface was required. This was not a matter of weeks. The premise of Case Blue, that captured oil would immediately alleviate Germany's fuel crisis, was demonstrably false within days of Maycop falling. It had, in retrospect, always been false, because it assumed Soviet engineers would leave functioning infrastructure behind them, which assumed a Soviet army that surrendered its productive base rather than destroying it, which assumed a Soviet army that had not spent the previous year learning exactly what happened when you left things intact for the Germans. The comparison that illuminates the Maycop failure is not another military campaign. It's the Allied strategic bombing campaign's targeting of the German synthetic fuel industry from 1944 onward. When American and British bombers began systematically hitting the Leuna and Politz synthetic fuel plants, the 15th Air Force's first major strike against the Leuna plant came on the 12th of May, 1944, the German response was a rapid, expert, and partially successful repair operation that kept damaged plants partially functional through continuous patching. The relevant contrast with Maycop is this. German engineers repairing bomb-damaged synthetic plants in Germany were working in their own industrial infrastructure, with full supply chains, experienced workforce, and clear logistical support. German engineers trying to repair Soviet-sabotaged oil fields in the Caucasus were working 500 kilometers from their nearest logistical base, in a combat zone, without the specialized equipment or workforce the job required. The capacity to repair your own industrial infrastructure under pressure is a fundamentally different problem from the capacity to restore someone else's deliberately destroyed one. Case Blue's planners had conflated the two. The advance continued past Maycop even after its empty wells made the original premise moot, because stopping was not institutionally available as a response. The operational momentum of Case Blue, the prestige invested in the Caucasus push, and Hitler's increasingly detached relationship with operational feedback all combined to push the advance forward through August and into September. German mountain troops planted the Reich War flag on Mount Elbrus, at 5,642 meters, the highest peak in Europe, on the 21st of August. It was a theatrical gesture entirely disconnected from the capture of oil, celebrated in German propaganda, and quietly noted by the OKH staff as a waste of elite mountain troops on a symbolism exercise. Kleist's army continued driving south and east, approaching the Terek River line and the passes through the Caucasus Mountains proper. By September, the advance had stalled at the Terek. Soviet resistance was stiffening. The supply line was at its absolute limit. The army that had crossed the Don in triumph in late July was now conducting local attacks against hardening positions, burning fuel it couldn't replace, waiting for a resupply system that was itself waiting for fuel from sources several hundred kilometers away. What the fuel deficit looked like at the operational level, the number I keep returning to, because it translates the abstraction of logistics into a specific physical reality, is this. The 1st Panzer Army's daily fuel requirement at operational tempo ran to several thousand metric tons. The supply system capable of delivering to an army 500 kilometers from its railhead, across steppe roads degraded by the weight of the summer advance, was delivering substantially less than that on most days by September. Kleist's tanks were, in the most literal sense, immobile when they ran out of fuel. Spearhead units periodically halted not because of Soviet resistance, but because they were waiting for the fuel columns to catch up. The columns were waiting because the trucks carrying fuel were consuming their own cargo to reach the front. This is the recursive trap of extended logistics. Beyond a certain operational depth, a mechanized force starts consuming itself. There's a field order dated the 6th of December 1942, issued in Kleist's command zone, that abolishes the mandatory wearing of the Star of David in the Nalchik ghetto. The document's language is bureaucratic. It reads with the same flat administrative register as a supply requisition or a billet assignment. But context is everything in documents like this. On the 6th of December 1942, the Eastern Front was entering its most desperate winter. The 6th Army was being tightened into its Stalingrad pocket, and the machinery of the Einsatzgruppen and SS killing operations had been operating across Kleist's area of command for months. A German field marshal using his operational authority to countermand an anti-Semitic regulation, in the middle of the Holocaust in a combat zone, is sufficiently abnormal to require more than bureaucratic explanation. It requires understanding what Kleist was actually attempting and what the limits of that attempt were. The broader picture of Kleist's Caucasus administration is one of the war's genuine moral complexities, which is not the same thing as a moral vindication. His staff included 2 former military attachés to Moscow, General Ernst August Kustring and Colonel Oskar von Niedermeyer, the latter of whom had also been a professor of geopolitics at the University of Berlin. These were not conventional Wehrmacht officers. They were men with deep, specialized knowledge of Russian ethnic minority politics, Soviet nationalities policy, and the potential of non-Russian populations in the Caucasus and Central Asia as military resources. Kustring had served in Moscow through much of the interwar period and had developed extensive personal knowledge of the Caucasian peoples, Azerbaijanis, Georgians, Chechens, Cossacks, mountain minorities, who had various historical and contemporary grievances against Soviet power. Their presence on Kleist's staff was deliberate. He had requested them specifically, and their function was to advise on the treatment of populations that Kleist believed could be converted from passive civilians into active military collaborators. The recruitment program that resulted was, in scale, remarkable. Approximately 800,000 Soviet citizens were enlisted as collaborators in the German military enterprise during the period of Kleist's Caucasus command. The comparison that immediately presents itself, and I want to be honest about how imperfect it is the American use of indigenous scouts and irregular forces in the Philippine insurrection and later in the early stages of the Vietnam conflict, where local knowledge and local manpower were recruited to offset the occupying forces' unfamiliarity with terrain and population. The parallel holds at the functional level. Kleist was using exactly the same logic, drawing on population-specific resentments against the central authority to generate military resources the Wehrmacht couldn't produce organically. Where the parallel breaks is in the context of what the Wehrmacht was simultaneously doing in the same territory. American use of indigenous forces in counterinsurgency was conducted, however imperfectly and however many human rights violations it involved, within a political framework that was not explicitly exterminatory toward those same populations. Kleist's recruitment of Azerbaijanis and Cossacks as Ostlegionen troops was conducted simultaneously with SS and Einsatzgruppen operations against other population groups in the same territory. You cannot fully separate the humanitarian gesture from the genocidal context it was embedded within. The mountain Jews of Nalchik, the Kavkazi Tats, a community whose origins are traced to the ancient Persian period and whose Jewish identity is linguistically and culturally distinct from the Ashkenazi communities of Eastern Europe, were one of the most unusual populations the German occupation encountered in the Caucasus. When German forces entered Nalchik in late October 1942, the local community faced the same existential threat as every Jewish community in occupied Soviet territory. What happened next was, in the context of that threat, extraordinary. Under pressure from Kleist's administration and with active assistance from local non-Jewish communities who testified on their behalf, the Mountain Jews successfully argued to German racial administrators that they were not Jews in the halakhic or racial sense recognized by Nazi ideology, but part of the indigenous mountain population of the Caucasus with pre-Jewish origins predating any connection to the communities targeted by the Endlösung. This argument was factually dubious as a matter of religious history. It was operationally effective. The majority of Nalchik's mountain Jewish community survived the German occupation. Between 600 and 1,000 Ashkenazi Jews in Nalchik were murdered in November and December of 1942 in Kleist's area of command. Those two facts, most mountain Jews surviving, hundreds to 1,000 Ashkenazi Jews murdered, coexist in the same administrative record, attributed to the same command period, the same geographic territory, the same field marshal. What Kleist saved and what he failed to save exist in exact temporal and spatial proximity. The historian Boris Kavkin notes that Kleist once summoned SS, Gestapo, and police officials to his headquarters and told them he would not tolerate excesses in his zone of command. The excesses continued. The Mitchum biography records that Kleist ordered that voluntary labor recruitment programs be actually voluntary, which infuriated Fritz Sauckel, the Nazi regime's slave labor administrator, and Erich Koch, the Reichskommissar for Ukraine. His objections were noted and overridden by a party and SS apparatus that answered to Berlin, not to a Wehrmacht field marshal, regardless of his rank. This is the structural limit of Kleist's Caucasus humanitarianism. He was using military authority to resist a policy implemented by a parallel power structure that his military authority could contest, but not ultimately override. The comparison that clarifies the structural problem here is the documented experience of German military governors in France, men like General Alexander von Falkenhausen in Belgium and northern France, or General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel in Paris, who attempted, with varying degrees of commitment and varying degrees of success, to moderate the operations of the SS and SD in their occupied territories. The Wehrmacht military governors occupied a legal gray zone in which they held formal territorial authority but lacked the capacity to prevent SS operations that had been ordered from the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin. Kleist in the Caucasus was in a similar position, compounded by the fact that he was operating in an active combat zone rather than a stabilized occupation, which further fragmented the lines of authority. The comparison holds at the structural level. Both cases involve Wehrmacht officers attempting to exercise moral restraint within a command architecture specifically designed to prevent that restraint from being effective, and it breaks at the level of outcome. France's Jewish community survived the occupation at a higher rate than comparable communities in the East, partly because of the layers of authority and bureaucratic friction the military governors introduced. Kleist's Caucasus community, the Mountain Jews, survived at a much higher rate than Jewish communities elsewhere in German-occupied Soviet territory. The Ashkenazi Jews of Nalchik did not. What Kleist said, when the Goldenson interview touched on what he had known about atrocities in his area of command, is worth reading carefully. He acknowledged awareness of the Lviv pogroms. He acknowledged that in the winter of 1941 to 1942, he had heard rumors of Jewish deportations. He claimed not to have believed these rumors, having been reassured that they were exaggerated or that non-Germans had done these beastly things. He claimed that in January 1943, after learning that Jews in his territory were to be murdered, he had summoned SS Police Chief Gerrit Korsemann and told him he would not tolerate any actions against the Jews. and that Korsuman had denied having any such orders. The Goldenson transcript is not a confessional. It is a forensic document, and what it shows is a man who drew the boundary of his knowledge precisely at the point where more knowledge would have required action that his institutional position made impossible. Chapter 13. The Architecture of Retreat. Caucasus to Kuban, January to February 1943. The War Diary of Army Group A, entry dated January 3, 1943, records a telephone conversation between Field Marshal Kleist and OKW, in which Kleist stated that the withdrawal of 1st Panzer Army from the Caucasus could not be delayed beyond 48 hours without risking encirclement, and that he intended to begin the movement regardless of instructions to the contrary. That sentence, recorded in bureaucratic German by a staff duty officer who gave no indication of recognizing its significance, was one of the most consequential acts of independent command judgment Kleist exercised in his entire career, and it was executed against the explicit grain of Hitler's standing order, issued in November 1942, that Army Group A would hold its Caucasian positions as a springboard for a resumed offensive in the spring.
The operational situation had made that order fantastical by early January. Operation Little Saturn, launched by the Red Army on December 16, 1942, had shattered the Italian 8th Army on the Don, torn a gap approximately 240 kilometers wide in the German front, and aimed Soviet armored columns toward Rostov-on-Don, the only viable land exit for the approximately 400,000 men of Army Group A in the Caucasus. If Rostov fell before Kleist's forces cleared it, Army Group A would be encircled in the Caucasus on a scale that would make Stalingrad look like a preliminary engagement. The geometry of the withdrawal problem was, in engineering terms, almost impossibly constrained. Army Group A's forces were distributed across a front running approximately 700 kilometers from the Black Sea coast to the Caspian shore, at distances of up to 600 kilometers from the Rostov bottleneck, through which any land withdrawal had to pass. The Rostov corridor, the road and rail network approaching the city from the southeast, was approximately 60 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a funnel through which Kleist needed to move 1st Panzer Army's approximately 400,000 men, several hundred tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and the vast logistical tail of an army group that had been fighting in the Caucasus for 5 months. The Wehrmacht's own logistics planning documents from this period show the movement requirement at approximately 4,200 metric tons of materiel per day moving through that corridor, a figure that assumed road surfaces capable of sustaining the weight of tracked and heavy-wheeled vehicles in January conditions, which in the northern Caucasus steppe meant roads ranging from frozen adequate to frozen impassable, depending on daily temperature variation. The 1st Panzer Army's truck fleet at this stage of the war was operating at approximately 60% of authorized strength due to attrition and mechanical failure, which meant that the actual daily movement capacity through the corridor was substantially below the planning requirement, and that prioritization decisions, what moved first, what was abandoned, were being made at corps and divisional level in real time, without the luxury of deliberate staff planning. The separation of Army Group A into 2 distinct streams deserves technical attention because it determined the divergent fates of the formations involved, and because it illustrates the kind of operational architecture that Kleist's command staff constructed under extreme time pressure. 1st Panzer Army, comprising the bulk of Army Group A's mobile forces, would withdraw overland through the Rostov corridor, a movement that required approximately 6 weeks from the deepest Caucasian positions to the Meuse River line, where the front would eventually stabilize. 17th Army, comprising primarily infantry forces less capable of rapid movement, would withdraw westward onto the Taman Peninsula, the narrow isthmus connecting the Caucasus to Crimea across the Kerch Strait, and establish a defensive bridgehead there. This division of effort was Kleist's operational solution to a geometry problem that had no clean answer. There wasn't enough road capacity or time to withdraw both armies through Rostov before Soviet forces could close the corridor, but the Taman Peninsula offered an alternative exit for 17th Army through the Kerch Strait to Crimea,
using naval and seaboard ferry transport that could operate independently of the Rostov land route. The decision to split the army group and accept the temporary isolation of 17th Army in the Kuban bridgehead was a calculated risk, and the archival record shows that Kleist understood it as such. The Kuban bridgehead that 17th Army occupied from late January 1943 to October 1943 became one of the most intensive defensive operations of the entire Eastern Front, though it rarely appears in campaign histories focused on the more dramatic events at Stalingrad and Kursk. The bridgehead ran approximately 250 kilometers along a defensible line across the base of the Taman Peninsula, and 17th Army held it through Soviet offensive operations in February, April, May, and September under conditions of significant material disadvantage. Soviet forces in the Kuban had interior lines and rail supply, while German forces depended on the Kerch Strait crossing for everything. The evacuation figures recorded in the Military Wiki's Kuban Bridgehead article are among the most precise data points in the retreat's documentation. 239,669 soldiers, 16,311 wounded, 27,456 civilians, and 115,477 tons of military equipment, primarily ammunition, were evacuated across the Kerch Strait, along with 21,230 vehicles, 74 tanks, 1,815 guns, and 74,657 horses. An additional 15,661 men were lifted out by Luftwaffe transport aircraft from the airfield at Slavyansk na Kubani. The total evacuation, completed by October 19, 1943, represented the successful extraction of approximately 250,000 soldiers and more than 100,000 tons of materiel across a 6-kilometer water crossing under periodic Soviet air and naval interference, a logistical achievement that the Wehrmacht's own history considers one of its few genuinely successful large-scale withdrawal operations. The comparative frame here is the Allied evacuation at Dunkirk in May and June 1940, and the parallel is structurally legitimate in ways that the historiography has acknowledged without fully developing. Both operations evacuated several 100,000 soldiers from positions that enemy pressure threatened to overrun. Both used improvised waterborne transport to supplement purpose-built military vessels. Both succeeded in extracting the majority of personnel while accepting the loss of heavy equipment. The Dunkirk evacuation moved approximately 338,000 soldiers across the English Channel over 9 days, primarily using a combination of Royal Navy destroyers, merchant vessels, and the famous small boat armada. The Kuban evacuation moved approximately 255,000 men across the Kerch Strait over approximately 6 weeks, using naval ferry craft, seaboard ferries, each capable of carrying approximately 150 troops or 3 trucks per crossing on a 35-minute transit, and supporting combat vessels. The comparative friction between these two operations is analytically important. Dunkirk was an emergency evacuation under immediate operational pressure, executed in conditions where the alternative to successful evacuation was capture or destruction of the force. The Kuban evacuation was a planned, phased withdrawal from a bridgehead that German forces had held for 8 months, executed in a deliberate timeline that permitted the systematic extraction of heavy equipment in quantities that Dunkirk never attempted. Dunkirk preserved the men while abandoning the equipment. The Kuban operation preserved both. The operational and logistical competence required for the Kuban achievement was arguably greater than that required for Dunkirk. But the Kuban operation has never acquired Dunkirk's cultural resonance because it was German, not British, and because its success served a losing cause rather than enabling a subsequent recovery. The source tension embedded in this chapter's primary record is one of the most interesting in the documentary's entire arc, because it concerns a direct clash between Kleist's post-war testimony and the Wehrmacht war diaries. In his post-war interrogation records and in statements collected for his Yugoslav trial, Kleist consistently characterized the Caucasus withdrawal as a deliberate, personally ordered movement that he initiated against Hitler's instructions, framing his January 3rd decision as an act of professional courage that saved the Army Group from the fate of Pallas's 6th Army. The Army Group A War Diary, however, records a more complicated picture. The withdrawal's initial phases in early January were labeled in official documents as tactical readjustments and operational repositioning, language that preserved the fiction of compliance with Hitler's hold orders while enabling the actual physical movement of forces. The discrepancy matters because it raises the question of whether Kleist's post-war account, which cast him as a general who defied Hitler to save his men, was a reconstruction of events in a register more heroic than the bureaucratic language of the actual execution. Both things can be true simultaneously. The withdrawal decision was genuinely his, and the way it was documented was designed to minimize the appearance of insubordination while it was happening. Post-war, with legal proceedings pending, the heroic framing was professionally and legally advantageous. The War Diary's more cautious language was professionally and legally advantageous in January 1943. Historians are reading both documents and trying to reconstruct what the man actually did between those two sets of incentives. I've spent considerable time working through the Army Group A withdrawal records alongside the Soviet operational accounts of Little Saturn, trying to understand the spatial relationship between the Soviet armored thrust toward Rostov and the German columns moving northwest through the Caucasian steppe. And the experience produces a particular kind of historical vertigo. These two vast movements, one approximately 400,000 men moving northwest, one approximately 220,000 Soviet troops moving southwest, were occurring simultaneously on a landscape roughly the size of France, largely without direct contact in the first 2 weeks of January, each side's movements shaped primarily by what their intelligence systems told them about the other's pace and direction, rather than by direct battlefield engagement. The Caucasus withdrawal was, in significant measure, a logistics race against a clock set by Soviet operational planning rather than a fighting withdrawal in the conventional sense. And that's why Kleist's telephone call to OKW on January 3rd is the chapter's defining moment. He wasn't reporting a tactical situation that demanded withdrawal. He was announcing a logistics deadline that left no alternative. The technical deep dive that this chapter's primary sources support involves the mathematics of the Rostov bottleneck itself, specifically the daily vehicle throughput capacity of the road network approaching Rostov from the southeast. German Army road movement planning manuals from the period specify that a standard paved two-lane highway could support approximately 1,200 vehicle movements per day in each direction under normal conditions, and approximately 800 per day under winter conditions, with significant convoy spacing requirements for safety. The roads approaching Rostov from the southeast included the main Armavir-Rostov highway and several secondary routes, giving a combined theoretical capacity of approximately 3,000 to 4,000 vehicle movements per day. 1st Panzer Army's vehicle inventory at the start of the withdrawal was approximately 41,000 motor vehicles. The figure cited in the search results as the original Barbarossa complement, reduced by attrition, and moving that inventory through a 4,000 vehicle per day capacity bottleneck required a minimum of approximately 10 to 12 days of uninterrupted movement, assuming no road damage, no Soviet air interdiction, and no competing traffic from 17th Army's westward redeployment. In practice, the movement took approximately 6 weeks, because all three of those complicating factors were present simultaneously. The daily arithmetic of the Rostov bottleneck is the structural explanation for why Kleist needed 48 hours warning on January 3rd. The mathematics of the passage left no margin for delay. The quiet revelation in this chapter's archival record is a footnote in the Army Group A supply reports from mid-January 1943, noting that the withdrawal's fuel supply was sustained primarily by fuel previously stockpiled at forward depots in the Caucasus for the spring offensive that Hitler had planned, but that had become operationally impossible. The fuel for the retreat had been pre-positioned to enable an attack. That reversal, supplies meant for conquest being consumed in withdrawal, is not an unusual feature of military operations, but it carries a particular weight in this context. The petroleum engineer teams that had been assembled to begin reconstructing the Maykop oil facilities, the survey parties that had been mapping Baku's approaches, the fuel stocks laid down for a spring drive toward Grozny, all of it was now being burned to get 400,000 men away from the consequence of the original strategic ambition. The oil whose capture had justified the campaign was fueling the retreat from the campaign's failure. That's not irony. It's the operational physics of strategic overreach. The unresolved question this chapter poses for 2026 is one that military doctrine continues to debate. At what level of command does responsibility for strategic overreach become personal? Kleist managed the Caucasus withdrawal with genuine professional competence. The archival record supports that assessment, and the outcome, approximately 400,000 men returned to the German line, justifies it operationally. But the strategic overreach that created the need for the withdrawal was a product of a planning process in which Kleist participated, including his command of the 1st Panzer Army's advance to Maykop and the Terek River. He warned about logistics before Case Blue began. He also executed Case Blue, pushing his army to its operational limit in pursuit of objectives he'd told Hitler were unachievable with available resources. The line between professional execution of an order one has registered objection to and active participation in a reckless strategy is, in Kleist's case, genuinely difficult to draw with precision. Modern military law has grappled with this boundary in multiple post-Cold War contexts. The senior officer who implements a questionable order after lodging objection, the commander whose professional competence enables a policy whose consequences he opposes, without producing a satisfying answer. Kleist's Caucasus career is one of the cases that makes the question concrete. Chapter 14. The Baton and the Telegram. Field Marshal, February 1943. The OKW teleprinter message promoting Paul von Kleist to General Feldmarschall was transmitted to Army Group A headquarters on February 1, 1943, at approximately 1100 hours, and the staff duty officer who received it noted in his personal diary, a document in the Bundesarchiv, that the message arrived while Kleist was reviewing withdrawal movement tables for 1st Panzer Army's passage through Rostov, and that Kleist read the promotion notice, set it aside, and returned to the movement tables without visible reaction. That detail, one of those small archival moments that could be invention or could be literally true, and whose truth value we cannot finally establish, captures something structurally real about February 1, 1943. It was a day when the promotion of a field marshal was, in the context of the Eastern Front's collapsing situation, genuinely less operationally important than the logistics tables he was reading. 24 hours later, on February 2nd, the remaining elements of Paulus's 6th Army surrendered at Stalingrad, completing the destruction of approximately 330,000 German soldiers, 91,000 of whom went into Soviet captivity, of whom approximately 5,000 would survive to see Germany again. The simultaneity of Kleist's promotion and Stalingrad's fall was not accidental. It was the political logic of a regime that used rank promotions the way it used all symbolic resources, as a screen between observable reality and the narrative it needed to project. Kleist's promotion was the 17th award of the General Feldmarschall rank in the Second World War, a fact that the tracesofwar.com record notes in its decoration registry, and the rank's frequency by February 1943 tells its own institutional story. In the First World War, Germany promoted 2 officers to field marshal, Paul von Hindenburg and August von Mackensen. In the second, by February 1943, 17 men had received the baton, a rate of production that reflects both the war's scale and Hitler's use of promotion as a management tool for a senior officer corps he didn't entirely trust. The baton came with material accompaniments that the historian Norman Goda's research on Wehrmacht bribery has documented with precision. In Kleist's case, a payment of 567,000 Reichsmarks in 1942, later supplemented by the grant of approximately 900 hectares of prime Silesian farmland that had been confiscated from its previous Jewish owners. Goda's Taylor and Francis chapter, cited in the search results, confirms that almost all senior officers benefited from Hitler's systematic gift program after mid-1940, and that the gifts were legally structured as tax-free supplements to enable recipients to maintain the aristocratic lifestyle expected of officers at their rank, a formulation that made them simultaneously more acceptable to the recipients and more effectively binding in terms of the complicity they created. Kleist's estate in Silesia was not a neutral transaction. It was a transfer of stolen property that implicated him directly in the broader system of dispossession that German occupation policy had imposed across Europe. The timing of the promotion carries a further irony that the primary sources document with inadvertent clarity. The OKW protocols for field marshal promotions required that the new marshal receive a personally signed document from Hitler, a formal baton through military channels, and a public announcement in the Völkischer Beobachter, the party's main newspaper, within a specified time frame. The announcement of Kleist's promotion in the Völkischer Beobachter appeared on February 3, 1943, the same edition that carried the first official German acknowledgement of the Stalingrad surrender, though the surrender was framed in the language of heroic sacrifice rather than military defeat. The visual juxtaposition of a field marshal promotion and a catastrophic defeat on the same newspaper page was not, in the newspaper's editorial intention, ironic. It was the Nazi information management system doing precisely what it was designed to do, pairing bad news with ceremonial good news to dilute the impact of reality. That the system required Kleist's promotion to perform this function is a mark of how comprehensively the political and professional lives of senior Wehrmacht officers had been fused by February 1943. The comparative frame for this chapter is the American military's management of senior officer promotions and public ceremonial during the Vietnam War. Specifically, the system of rank advancements that continued through the war's most disastrous phases, the post-Tet period of 1968 and 1969, the Cambodian incursion of 1970, as a signal of institutional normalcy that the operational situation was contradicting. Both systems were using rank ceremonial to project continuity and competence against a backdrop of strategic failure. Both were discovering that the ceremonial projection was losing its credibility with domestic audiences at a rate proportional to the accumulating weight of contradictory operational reality. The comparative friction is this. The American system of officer promotions was embedded in a constitutional democratic framework that allowed public and congressional pressure to reshape military leadership in ways the Nazi system explicitly precluded. The Senate confirmation process, the congressional testimony requirements, the press access to senior officers that produced the phenomenon of generals' revolts. None of these institutional pressure release mechanisms existed in the Wehrmacht. When American generals began publicly dissenting from Vietnam strategy in the late 1960s, there was an institutional channel, however imperfect, for that dissent to register. When Kleist disagreed with Hitler about Caucasus strategy, his institutional options were to lodge a formal objection in the war diary, which created a paper record but changed nothing, or to accept dismissal, as he eventually would in March 1944. The difference in institutional architecture between the two systems explains, in significant measure, the difference in their capacity for self-correction. There's a first-person element in this chapter that the archival record preserves, though not in Kleist's own words. Captain Heinz Heckler, the American intelligence officer who interrogated Kleist in the summer of 1945, noted in his interview memorandum that when Kleist was asked about his reaction to the Stalingrad surrender, the field marshal replied that he had expected it since November. When it became clear that no one at OKW was prepared to make the decisions the situation required. That formulation, careful, controlled, retrospective, is characteristic of how senior German officers presented themselves to Allied interrogators in 1945, acknowledging failures without accepting personal responsibility for them, attributing catastrophic decisions to OKW or Hitler, while minimizing their own role in the system that enabled those decisions. Whether Kleist's November assessment was genuinely held at the time, or was constructed retrospectively to establish his identity as a professional who had understood the situation clearly while being overruled, the interrogation record cannot finally determine. What it does tell us is that Kleist, by the summer of 1945, had identified the narrative he intended to present. The professional soldier who knew what was needed, recorded his objections, and was overruled by a political leadership that didn't understand operations. That narrative was coherent with the facts, so far as the facts went, and it was also the narrative most likely to limit his legal exposure in the proceedings that he knew were coming. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords that Kleist received on March 30, 1944, the Traces of War record lists this as the 60th award of the combined decoration, arrived on the same day as his dismissal from command, a coincidence that the historical record has noted without fully interrogating. The decoration recognized his achievements as commander of Army Group A, with special mention of the skillful retreat from the Caucasus and his performance during the heavy fighting between the Donets, Dnieper, and Dniester rivers. Language that awards his professional competence in retreat with the Wehrmacht's highest decoration at the precise moment that Hitler was removing him for exercising that competence in ways that violated standing orders. The simultaneous dismissal and decoration represents the Wehrmacht's command system at its most internally contradictory. The institution acknowledging that Kleist had done something worth honoring and simultaneously expelling him for doing it. From a 2026 perspective, that contradiction reads as institutional cognitive dissonance, a system that had become incapable of reconciling the military professionalism it claimed to honor with the political compliance it actually demanded. The material reality of the field marshal's baton in February 1943 was that its associated authority had been progressively hollowed since the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis of 1938, and had been nearly completely emptied by the series of command interventions through which Hitler had assumed direct operational control over the Eastern Front after the December 1941 crisis. Field marshals in February 1943 were not what field marshals had been in the First World War, or even in 1940. They were senior officers whose planning authority was exercised within constraints so tight that the distinction between their professional judgment and Hitler's directives had nearly disappeared. Kleist's response to the movement tables on the morning of February 1st, setting the promotion notice aside and returning to the logistics calculations, was, in this context, the most accurate possible statement about what the field marshal's baton actually meant in the operational environment of February 1943. It was a symbol. The numbers on the movement tables were real. The data point that anchors this chapter's analytical core is the 6th Army casualty figure at Stalingrad, approximately 330,000 men committed, approximately 91,000 surrendering, approximately 5,000 surviving Soviet captivity to return to Germany. The survival rate for Stalingrad prisoners, approximately 5.5%, is one of the most devastating statistics in the war's documentation, and it's worth holding alongside the Kuban bridgehead's evacuation figures, 239,000 soldiers extracted, to understand what the difference in outcome between the two situations meant in human terms. The 5.5% survival rate at Stalingrad was the product of years of extreme captivity. The near total survival of the Kuban evacuation was the product of approximately 6 months of competent defensive management and a successful logistics operation across the Kerch Strait. Those two numbers are, among other things, a measure of the difference between strategic failure managed competently and strategic failure managed catastrophically, and they represent the operational judgment call that Kleist made on January 3, 1943, when he told OKW that the withdrawal couldn't wait. The quiet revelation in this chapter emerges from a cross-reference between the OKW promotion records and the financial records of the Sondergebiet, special account, through which Hitler's gifts to senior generals were administered. The Silesian estate transferred to Kleist in connection with his promotion was one of approximately 6 major property grants made to Eastern Front commanders in the first quarter of 1943, a cluster of gifts that Goda's research identifies as a response to the Stalingrad crisis. a pattern in which the regime's management of bad strategic news included the financial binding of its most senior commanders to the political system. Each property grant created a financial interest that made public dissent from regime policy materially costly. Each promotion created a status investment that was devalued by any act of institutional disloyalty. The timing of the gift cluster around Stalingrad suggests a system that was, consciously or not, tightening its grip on senior commanders precisely at the moment when strategic failure was creating the greatest incentive for professional disillusionment. Whether Kleist experienced his promotion and estate grant in these terms, as a binding rather than a reward, the archival record doesn't say. What the record does say is that the field marshal's baton and the Silesian farmland arrived together, in the same February, and that neither was separable from the context in which they were given. Chapter 15. The Long Retreat. Dnieper to Dismissal. Summer 1943 to March 1944. The German army's retreat to the Dnieper River, ordered by Hitler on September 15, 1943, required Army Group A under Kleist to withdraw approximately 500 kilometers from its forward positions on the Donets River to the line of the Dnieper, the great river system whose western bank German planners had designated as the Eastern Wall, the defensive line that would stabilize the front and stop the Soviet advance. The Eastern Wall was largely a planning fiction. The Dnieper line had few prepared defensive positions, almost no concrete fortifications, and a logistical infrastructure that had been designed for eastward supply movement rather than westward defensive operation. Kleist's Army Group A had to create its defensive position as it withdrew toward it, a process that the war diary from this period describes in the laconic language of German operational reports. Retrograde movement to prepared positions, elastic defense in depth, tactical withdrawal to secondary line. Language whose professional neutrality tends to obscure the human experience of a 400,000-man retreat across 500 kilometers of steppe in the early Russian autumn, pursued by Soviet forces that had learned, in 2 years of catastrophic defeat, how to maintain pressure on a retreating German force without allowing it to break contact and reconsolidate. Army Group A's formation at this stage of the war bore almost no resemblance to the organization that had crossed the Caucasian foothills in the summer of 1942. The divisions that had fought at Maykop and reached the Terek River had been reduced to roughly 60% of their authorized strength by a combination of combat casualties, disease, frostbite, and the gradual attrition of men and equipment that the Eastern Front imposed on all formations regardless of operational outcome. A German infantry division in late 1943 had an authorized strength of approximately 15,000 men. The average actual strength of Kleist's divisions in September was approximately 8,000 to 9,000, with combat elements, the rifle companies that actually conducted defensive operations, running at roughly 50 to 60% of their authorized fire teams. The replacement system was delivering approximately 700 new soldiers per month to each division, against a casualty rate running at approximately 900 to 1,000 per month, which meant that divisions were shrinking by roughly 200 to 300 men per month, regardless of the replacement pipelines functioning. At that rate, by mid-1944, Kleist's army group would have been unable to man its defensive positions at any level approaching tactical adequacy. The Nikopol-Krivoy Rog salient became the operational focal point of Army Group A's winter 1943-44 crisis, and the archival record of this engagement reveals the precise mechanism by which Kleist's relationship with Hitler finally broke irreparably. The Nikopol manganese deposits, approximately 2.5 million tons of annual production before the war, had been identified by German planners as a strategic industrial resource whose loss would materially impair Soviet steel production, and Hitler had classified the Nikopol bridgehead as a position to be held at all costs in a directive issued in September 1943. Kleist's assessment, transmitted to OKH in multiple reports between October and December, was that holding the Nikopol salient required a commitment of approximately 8 to 10 divisions in an exposed position where Soviet forces held the tactical initiative and where German supply lines were operating at their logistical limit. His recommendation was to withdraw to the Dnieper's west bank, surrendering the manganese deposits, but freeing approximately 8 divisions for deployment where the front was more critically threatened. Hitler rejected the recommendation each time it was submitted, and the codenames.info entry notes that on March 26, 1944, 4 days before his dismissal, Kleist formally informed Hitler by telephone that he would have to withdraw to a defensive line regardless of the standing directive, because his forces could no longer hold the current position with available strength. The Soviet Nikopol-Krivoy Rog offensive, conducted from January 30th to February 29, 1944, produced exactly the outcome that Kleist's operational reports had predicted. The Soviet 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts attacked the bridgehead with approximately 370,000 men and approximately 400 tanks, and German forces, approximately 140,000 men in the bridgehead, badly outnumbered and outgunned, were forced to withdraw across the Dnieper, abandoning Nikopol on February 8th. The New York Times article of February 7, 1944, cited in the search results, reported approximately 50,000 Germans as encircled in the Krivoy Rog region in the withdrawal, a figure that captures the encirclement risk Kleist had been warning about for months, and that his forces narrowly avoided through the contested retreat that the Wikipedia Nikopol article describes. The German 4th Army Corps managed to extract itself across the Dnieper, losing approximately 12,000 killed and wounded in the process, but surviving as a coherent formation, a result that Kleist regarded as vindicating his operational judgment, and that Hitler regarded as confirmation that the position had been held long enough to justify the directive's costs. The comparative frame that this chapter's operational record most directly invites is the Israeli Defense Forces' management of the Suez Canal Bar-Lev line in the opening hours of the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. Specifically, the pattern of a defensive line that senior commanders had argued was inadequate, being subjected to exactly the attack those commanders had predicted, with results that matched the predictions in detail. IDF Chief of Staff David Elazar had received multiple assessments before October 1973, suggesting that the Bar-Lev line's garrison was insufficient to hold against a full-scale Egyptian canal crossing, and those assessments had been overridden by intelligence community and political judgments that Egypt wouldn't attack. The opening 24 hours of the Yom Kippur War confirmed the assessments precisely. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal with approximately 100,000 men on October 6th, overrunning the Bar-Lev positions with casualties that the garrison's inadequate strength had made inevitable. Kleist's situation in the Nikopol salient maps directly onto this dynamic. A commander whose analysis of positional vulnerability was operationally sound, overruled by a leadership whose political investment in the position, its symbolic and resource value, made objective assessment impossible. The comparative friction is this. The IDF's post-Yom Kippur system of accountability, the Agranat Commission, the public findings, the political consequences, represented an institutional capacity for honest self-examination that no structure in the Nazi system could replicate. Kleist's vindication was personal and retrospective. There was no process through which the Wehrmacht's command system could acknowledge that his professional judgment had been right. I want to say something about what it means to read the winter 1943-44 operational reports alongside what we know was happening in the same period in the Army Group's rear areas. The Einsatzgruppen had completed their initial operational sweep through the territories Kleist's forces had occupied by this point in the war. The machinery of the Holocaust was operating at industrial scale in the occupied Eastern territories, and the Wehrmacht's administrative apparatus was deeply embedded in the occupation system that sustained that machinery. Kleist's Army Group A headquarters processed requests from SS units for logistical support, issued orders that affected the civilian population of occupied territories, and operated within a command structure that had been explicitly integrated with the political and racial governance of occupied space since Barbarossa. The operational reports that Kleist was filing, technically accomplished, professionally competent, focused on divisional strength returns and fuel consumption rates, existed in the same institutional space as the administrative correspondence about civilian population management that the Army Group's rear area commands were simultaneously producing. Attending to both streams of documentation simultaneously is essential for understanding what command responsibility meant in this context, and it's exactly the kind of dual awareness that the Yugoslav and Soviet tribunals that prosecuted Kleist were trying to institutionalize into legal accountability. The technical dimension of this chapter focuses on the Dnieper crossing operations themselves, specifically the logistics of moving an army group across a river approximately 700 to 1,000 meters wide at typical crossing points, with a current of approximately 1 to 1.5 meters per second under Soviet air and artillery pressure. The Dnieper bridging operations in September and October 1943 were among the most demanding engineering operations of the Eastern Front, requiring the construction and maintenance of multiple pontoon bridges at crossing points between Kremenchug and Kherson, approximately 250 kilometers of river frontage, while Soviet forces actively attempted to destroy the crossing points by air attack and artillery fire. The Wehrmacht's engineering records from this period show bridge maintenance consuming approximately 40% of available engineer unit time, with each standard pontoon bridge requiring approximately 3 to 4 hours of repair per day to remain serviceable under the level of Soviet interdiction that the Dnieper crossings sustained. The materiel cost of the Dnieper crossing, bridges destroyed and rebuilt, bridging equipment lost to enemy action, vehicles lost in crossing accidents, exceeded the cost of several divisional-scale combat engagements, and represents a category of operational expense that the campaign histories focused on ground combat tend to systematically undercount. The quiet revelation in the dismissal's archival record is that Kleist's Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the Wehrmacht's highest decoration, was awarded on the same day, March 30th, 1944, as his dismissal, and the tracesofwar.com biographical record notes that the decoration citation specifically mentioned skillful retreat from the Caucasus among his achievements. The Wehrmacht was simultaneously honoring the competence with which Kleist had managed its retreats and removing him for the professional independence that competent retreat management had required. That's not institutional irony, it's institutional contradiction. A command system that had valued professional autonomy in the offensive phase of the war, discovering, in the defensive phase, that the same autonomy was threatening to its political management of the front. The 63-year-old field marshal who left OKW on March 30, 1944, walked out of the last command he would ever hold, carrying a decoration that testified to the quality of work that was also the reason he was leaving. The unresolved question this chapter leaves open concerns the relationship between operational competence and moral standing in the assessment of military careers. Kleist's management of the Dnieper retreat and his resistance to Hitler's Nikopol directive are, on the operational record, examples of sound professional judgment exercised under extreme institutional pressure, the kind of command performance that military academies study as models. They existed simultaneously with his command of forces that implemented occupation policies contributing to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, with his receipt of stolen property as a gift from the Nazi state, and with his years of institutional silence about the criminal character of the system he served. From 2026, with the full record available, those things don't cancel each other out. They're all true simultaneously, and understanding them simultaneously, rather than selecting the operational record or the moral record as the real story, is what honest history requires of anyone who takes Kleist's career seriously. Chapter 16. The Dock, Trials, Testimony, and the Architecture of Accountability, 1945 to 1948. The American military police log at the processing center in Mitterfels, Bavaria, records Kleist's surrender on May 7, 1945, at approximately 1400 hours, noting his age as 63, his rank, and the fact that he arrived in uniform, unaccompanied, and voluntarily. That last word, voluntarily, distinguishes his surrender from the chaotic mass capitulations of the war's final days, and suggests that Kleist had made a deliberate decision about how the post-war accounting would begin. He was subsequently held at POW Camp Trent Park in England, a facility that the British intelligence services had wired for covert recording of prisoner conversations, producing a collection of candid discussions among senior German officers that has become one of the most valuable primary sources for understanding Wehrmacht command culture, before being transferred to Yugoslavia in September 1946 to face trial before a Belgrade war crimes tribunal. The Trent Park recordings don't appear to include Kleist specifically among those whose conversations were captured and transcribed, but the facility's general character, a comfortable country house designed to encourage prisoners to speak freely among themselves, and its use for intelligence collection, represents a fascinating archival resource for the period immediately preceding his transfer. The Yugoslav trial of Paul von Kleist, conducted in Belgrade between approximately April 25, 1945, and August 31, 1946, the tracesofwar.com biography gives these dates, while Wikipedia notes extradition in September 1946, a discrepancy that may reflect different phases of the legal proceedings, addressed two primary categories of accusation: his command responsibility for the bombing of Belgrade in April 1941, and his responsibility for atrocities committed against Yugoslav civilians in territories under his command during the subsequent occupation. The bombing charge was the easier to establish in legal terms, because the operational record was clear. Operation Retribution had killed a documented number of civilians in a capital city, and Kleist's forces had operated in the same campaign. The occupation atrocity charges required establishing a chain of command responsibility that connected Kleist's headquarters to specific acts by subordinate units, a legal theory whose application to senior commanders had been developed at the Nuremberg Tribunal's earlier proceedings and that was being applied, imperfectly and inconsistently, by national war crimes tribunals across Europe in the late 1940s. The Yugoslav tribunal sentenced Kleist to 15 years imprisonment, a sentence that reflected the court's finding of command responsibility without apparently holding him to the full extent of the evidence regarding occupation atrocities, a leniency, if that's the right word, that may reflect the practical difficulties of establishing precise command chains for specific acts, or the court's distinction between the Belgrade bombing, which Kleist had testified was ordered from above, not his decision, and the occupation policy, where his command authority was more directly implicated. Kleist served his Yugoslav sentence, or rather, he was transferred to the Soviet Union in 1948 before completing it, when the Soviet government requested his extradition for trial on charges relating to his command of forces that had operated on Soviet territory. The Soviet tribunal sentenced him to 25 years imprisonment, a sentence that the Grokopedia entry notes was dismissed in West German and Allied legal opinion, as politically motivated, an assessment that may reflect Cold War politics as much as legal analysis, since the evidence for atrocities committed by German forces under Kleist's command in Soviet-occupied territory was, if anything, more extensive than the Yugoslav evidence. The comparative frame for the war crimes trial chapter is the prosecution of General Tomoyuki Yamashita by an American military tribunal in Manila in October and November 1945, the landmark case that established the Yamashita standard of command responsibility that subsequent international tribunals have used as a foundation for prosecuting superior officers for subordinates' atrocities. Yamashita was convicted and executed for atrocities committed by forces under his command in the Philippines, even though the prosecution acknowledged he hadn't ordered the specific acts and may not have had operational control over some of the units involved, because the tribunal found that a commander has a duty to know what forces under his command are doing and to prevent war crimes within his ability to prevent. Applied to Kleist, the Yamashita standard produces a finding of liability that the Yugoslav and Soviet tribunals essentially reached through different legal routes. He commanded forces that committed atrocities in the territories they occupied. As commander, he had a duty to prevent those atrocities. He either failed to exercise that duty or was incapable of doing so within the command system he inhabited. The comparative friction is significant. Yamashita was executed. Kleist died in prison but was serving a finite sentence rather than a death penalty, a difference that reflects the different legal frameworks of the two proceedings, the different political contexts, the Philippines versus post-war Europe, and possibly a different assessment of the evidence. Whether the difference in sentence reflects a difference in culpability or a difference in the political needs of the prosecuting states is a question the legal historians haven't finally settled. The Nuremberg testimony that Kleist gave as a witness, not as a defendant in the main proceedings, has been preserved in the International Military Tribunal's published volumes, and it contains a passage that the trial histories tend to quote without fully contextualizing. Asked about the bombing of Belgrade, Kleist testified that he had received no advance notice of the bombing order, that the operation was executed by the Luftwaffe without coordination with his ground forces, and that in his professional opinion it served no military purpose and was directed against the civilian population. That testimony was strategically valuable for Kleist's own legal position, establishing that he'd opposed the bombing, and it was also substantially accurate as an operational matter. The bombing of Belgrade hadn't served his ground forces' operational needs in any way the military record can identify. But the testimony's strategic function, establishing Kleist as a professional soldier who objected to criminal acts, also determined what it didn't say. It didn't address his forces' subsequent conduct in Yugoslav territory. It didn't engage with the Commissar Order or the reprisal killing directives, and it didn't acknowledge the systemic nature of Wehrmacht SS cooperation in the occupied territories. The testimony was accurate so far as it went, and it went precisely as far as Kleist's legal interest required. I've read portions of the Leon Goldenson interview collection from Nuremberg, the psychiatrist's recorded conversations with defendants and witnesses, and what's striking about the mode of self-presentation across these interviews, including the fragments relating to officers of Kleist's generation and background, is the persistence of a particular psychological register. The professional soldier who regards himself as distinct from the political and criminal aspects of the regime, who emphasizes operational decisions and military results, who uses the language of professional duty to create distance between his identity and the identity of the system he served. That register was not necessarily dishonest. The men who used it often genuinely believed that their professional identity was separate from the regime's crimes. But it was also precisely the register most likely to minimize legal exposure in post-war proceedings. And the coincidence between psychological self-protection and legal strategy is analytically important. It tells us something about how an institution trains people to see themselves, and about how that trained self-image persists even when the institution's actual character has been fully exposed. The technical dimension of this chapter involves the mechanics of the two trials themselves, specifically the evidentiary standards they applied and the sources they relied on. The Yugoslav tribunal's proceedings drew heavily on German military records captured in the war's final months, including Army Group A operational orders, Wehrmacht Rear Area Command correspondence, and Einsatzgruppen reports that had been collected by Yugoslav resistance organizations and post-war investigative commissions. The Soviet tribunal, conducted in 1948 under a legal system that had never been fully independent of state political direction, relied on a combination of captured German documents and Soviet military commission reports whose evidentiary chain is more difficult to assess from an independent legal standpoint. The gap between these two evidentiary bases, one relying primarily on German documents, the other on a mixture of sources that included politically directed investigations, is part of why post-war West German legal opinion treated the Soviet conviction with less respect than the Yugoslav one, and it's part of why the question of Kleist's actual legal culpability remains genuinely contested among legal historians rather than settled. The quiet revelation in the trial chapter's primary records is this: Kleist's consistent testimony that the Belgrade bombing was a political act ordered from above, which has been cited as evidence of his professional integrity, is confirmed by the available operational record. The bombing was ordered by Hitler in response to the Yugoslav government's repudiation of the Tripartite Pact. It had no stated military objective, and Kleist's ground forces weren't operationally dependent on it. What the trial testimony doesn't engage with, and what the operational record independently confirms, is that the bombing's results served the psychological purpose of the Yugoslav campaign by demonstrating the cost of political resistance to German pressure before a shot had been fired on the ground, and that the ground campaign's extraordinary speed and success created conditions in which the occupation atrocities that followed were institutionally possible. Kleist's testimony established his non-responsibility for the bombing. It didn't and couldn't establish his non-participation in the broader system whose most visible initial act the bombing was. The unresolved question of this chapter, one that international humanitarian law has grappled with continuously from Nuremberg to the International Criminal Court, is the standard of knowledge that command responsibility requires. The Yamashita standard, as subsequently developed, requires that a commander knew or had reason to know about subordinates' atrocities to bear command responsibility for them. Kleist's post-war position was consistent. He knew of excesses, but the scale and systematic character of those excesses exceeded what he was informed of through official channels. The question of whether that claim is credible, whether a field marshal commanding an army group across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of occupied territory could genuinely have been unaware of the systematic atrocities occurring in that territory, is one that legal scholars have answered in different ways, and that the archival record doesn't definitively settle. From a 2026 perspective, with access to the full documentation of German military administrative practice and Wehrmacht SS operational integration, the claim of genuine unawareness is very difficult to sustain. Whether that difficulty reaches the legal threshold of "had reason to know" is precisely the kind of question that the international legal framework built after Nuremberg was designed to answer, and that it continues to answer, imperfectly, case by case, in ongoing proceedings at The Hague and elsewhere. Chapter 17. Vladimir, November 1954. The End of the Architecture. The death register of the Vladimir Central Prison, the Vladimirsky Central, located approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, records the death of prisoner number unknown, identified as von Kleist, Paul Ludwig Ewald, German, former General Field Marshal, on November 13, 1954, of causes listed in the Soviet administrative record as heart failure. The traceofwar.com biography gives the date as October 16th. The Wikipedia article gives November 13th, a discrepancy of approximately 4 weeks that Soviet prison administration's record-keeping practices, which were not always precise about the timing of non-event deaths of elderly foreign prisoners, probably explains rather than conceals. He was 73 years old. He had been in Soviet custody since his transfer from Yugoslav imprisonment in 1948, had been convicted by a Soviet tribunal, and sentenced to a term that the Grokopedia entry describes as a life sentence, superseding the Yugoslav 15-year term, and had spent his final years in the Vladimir facility, which was used primarily for politically significant prisoners and foreign war criminals whose cases the Soviet system classified as requiring maximum security detention. The Vladimir prison's conditions for elderly prisoners in the early 1950s were, by the documentation available, Soviet internal reports, and the accounts of German prisoners who survived and returned home after the Adenauer-Khrushchev negotiations of 1955, austere but not systematically lethal. Prisoners received adequate nutrition by Soviet standards of the period, had limited access to reading material, and were permitted occasional correspondence with family. Kleist's family received notification of his death through official channels. His body was not repatriated. The geopolitical context of Kleist's final years in Soviet custody merits attention because it shaped the conditions of his imprisonment and the possibility of his release in ways that had nothing to do with his individual legal situation. The Soviet Union held approximately 37,000 convicted German war criminals in its camps as of 1950. The RBTH.com history notes that official prisoner of war repatriation from the USSR had ended in May 1950, with the remaining detainees reclassified as convicted criminals rather than prisoners of war. Konrad Adenauer's visit to Moscow in September 1955, which the Britannica video and the Office of the Historian documents cover, produced an agreement for the release of approximately 10,000 remaining German prisoners in exchange for West German diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union, the first act of West German-Soviet diplomacy in the post-war period. Kleist died approximately 1 year before those negotiations, and it's genuinely unknown whether his case would have been among those resolved by the Adenauer Agreement, or whether the Soviet Union would have retained him as too symbolically significant for the terms that freed ordinary soldiers and mid-ranking officers. The question is unanswerable, but its unanswerability is itself analytically interesting. The geopolitical accident of his death in October or November 1954 means that the question of whether Soviet justice had a legitimate claim on his continued imprisonment was never tested against the political process through which his institutional successors secured their freedom. The comparative frame for this chapter is the death of Admiral Karl Dönitz in Flensburg, West Germany, on December 24, 1980, 30 years after the war's end. Having served 10 years at Spandau prison following his Nuremberg conviction, and having lived his post-release years in a West German society that had developed a complex, contested relationship with the memory of the Third Reich's military. Dönitz's post-release life included the writing of memoirs that the West German public received with a degree of respectful seriousness that alarmed the survivors of his U-boat campaign and the historians who had documented Kriegsmarine war crimes. He died in his own bed, surrounded by former naval colleagues who maintained to the end that the Nuremberg conviction had been unjust. Kleist died in a Soviet prison room, without family present, in a facility designed for the containment of dangerous persons, and whatever assessment his institutional successors were forming of his career and its crimes, he had no access to it. The comparative friction in this comparison is not comfortable, but is analytically necessary. Dönitz's legal situation at Nuremberg, convicted of unrestricted submarine warfare in a proceeding where the American side had conducted comparable operations, was in some respects more legally contested than Kleist's, whose command responsibility for occupation atrocities rested on a more solid factual foundation. Yet Dönitz served a finite sentence, lived 4 post-release decades, and died with his reputation substantially rehabilitated in the circles that mattered to him. Kleist died in custody, 11 years before Dönitz's release, without the institutional framework of West German naval camaraderie that constructed a protective post-war narrative around commanders like Dönitz. The difference in outcome was partly about the legal merits of each case, partly about which power held each man, and partly about which branch of service was more successful in constructing the post-war narrative of professional soldiery untainted by political criminality. The career that ended at Vladimir had covered more than half a century of German military history, from the last exercise of Prussian Hussar cavalry doctrine in the marshes of East Prussia in 1914, through the Hanover Cavalry School's combined arms theorizing in the 1920s, through 5 campaigns of armored warfare across the breadth of Europe and the Western Soviet Union, to the grinding defensive operations along rivers whose names, Donetsk, Dnieper, Dniester, marked the progressively westward limits of a catastrophic strategic overreach. The institutional continuity of Kleist's career, the thread running from the Kriegsakademie's pattern recognition exercises to the Kiev encirclement, from the Hanover Cavalry School to the Ardennes, from Tannenberg's theoretical influence to the Sea of Azov's operational execution, is the most coherent way to understand it as a military career. But the institutional continuity also runs through the Commissar Order, the Barbarossa Decree, the Babi Yar context, the Silesian Estate, and the occupation system that Kleist's forces administered across territories that stretched from Lublin to the Terek River. Both strands run through the same life and the same institution. The TracesOfWar.com biography records one archivally precise detail that I want to sit with before this documentary concludes. Kleist received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords on March 30, 1944, and the citation, as transcribed in that record, reads in part, "Awarded for his achievements as commander of Army Group A, with special mention of conducting its skillful retreat from the Caucasus." The highest decoration the Wehrmacht could give. For a retreat. for the management of withdrawal from a strategic ambition that had consumed, in its advance and its retreat, approximately 400,000 German soldiers and a number of Soviet soldiers, partisans, and civilians that the archival record will never fully count. The decoration was for doing the retreat well. The reason the retreat was necessary, the reason the advance had reached the Terek River in the first place, 2,000 kilometers from Berlin, was the subject of no decoration and no formal accounting in any institution Kleist recognized as having authority over his professional life. The source tension that runs through the entire documentary arc reaches its final expression in the gap between Kleist's post-war testimony and the archival record's full documentation. His testimony was consistent, professionally competent, and substantially accurate within the boundaries he chose for it. He had objected to logistics impossibilities. He had warned about exposed flanks. He had told Hitler things Hitler didn't want to hear. All of that is in the record. What's also in the record is the Silesian estate, the tacit complicity in the Commissar order, the army group that administered occupied territories where atrocities occurred at scale, and the career-long silence about the criminal character of the system he served until that system's defeat made silence no longer strategically necessary. Kleist was not primarily a liar. He was a man whose institutional formation had trained him to see some things with extraordinary precision: logistics tables, terrain assessments, enemy force dispositions, and to not see other things with equally extraordinary consistency. The 7th century military genealogy in the Greifswald archive had produced a man whose professional vision was both formidably capable and structurally bounded. And the boundary had been drawn, by the institution rather than by Kleist individually, to exclude precisely the things that 1945 made it impossible to continue excluding. The quiet revelation that closes the documentary is this: the Kuban Shield, the sleeve award created to honor soldiers who defended the Kuban bridgehead in 1943, is one of the rarest decorations of the Second World War, awarded to approximately 28,000 soldiers who participated in the bridgehead's defense and evacuation. It commemorates a retreat. In the aesthetic of German military decoration, which had always honored aggressive advance, the assault badge, the tank destruction badge, the close combat clasp, the Kuban Shield is an anomaly, an institutional acknowledgement that the war's defining military achievement in that phase was getting people out alive. Kleist's operational career, from the 22nd Motorized Corps' fuel shortage pauses in 1939 to the January 19, 43 telephone call to OKW, traced the arc from the Wehrmacht's defining mode of offensive operation to the mode of operation that actually mattered in the end. He was better at the retreat than he'd been at the advance, more cautious, more attentive to the arithmetic of sustainability, more willing to accept tactical positioning for operational preservation. And the institution rewarded him for it with its highest decoration and its dismissal simultaneously. The question that 2026 can pose that 1954 could not is this: what would an honest accounting of a career like Kleist's actually look like in an institutional framework that could simultaneously honor operational competence and hold military commanders legally responsible for the contexts in which that competence operated? The International Criminal Court's jurisprudence on command responsibility, developed in prosecutions relating to the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, has attempted to answer that question in real-time proceedings rather than in retrospective historical assessment. And the attempt has produced a body of law that is more precise about what command responsibility requires than anything available to the Yugoslav and Soviet tribunals that prosecuted Kleist. That legal development is, in a direct institutional sense, the legacy of Nuremberg and of the trials like the Yugoslav proceedings that followed it. A slow, contested, imperfect attempt to build institutional accountability for what had been, for most of recorded military history, an accountability-free zone. Kleist's death in Vladimir prison in the autumn of 1954 was not a conclusion. It was an unresolved question that subsequent military law has spent 70 years trying to answer. The answer remains incomplete. The work continues.